The smell reached Marlbury Market Square before the sound did. Rust and sweat, and something sourer beneath them, the kind of smell a body understands before the mind gets around to naming it. The smell of an animal that had been frightened so long it had forgotten what it was frightened of. Then the sound arrived. A long, low scream torn out of a chest, nothing like anything a human throat could make. It rolled across the cobbles of Marlbury Market Square like cannon fire carried over a hill, and it lifted the pigeons off the church tower and pinned every stallholder, every child, every housewife exactly where they stood. Honora Redfern heard it from behind her herb stall, her fingers still working a knot of twine around a bundle of dried chamomile. She looked up. The crowd had already begun to move, and it moved the way people always move when something terrible is coming, backward, pressing into one another, treading on hems and baskets. Eyes fixed on the far end of the square where the country road spilled into the town. On the wall of the Fleece, the recruiting bill was still damp with paste. Beside it hung yesterday's notice, the one that said the Queen's fleet had passed into the Dardanelles. All morning, the men at the market had talked about nothing but the Russians. By noon, nobody in Marlbury would remember the Russians at all, because the thing coming into the square, dragging 3 grown men behind 3 separate ropes, was a horse the whole of the south of England had agreed to call by a single name, and not one person in that crowd knew the name was a lie. A black lacquered carriage came first, 4 gray drafts in the traces, the coachman sitting rigid with his whip laid flat across his knees, like a man who had given up the idea of using it hours ago. Behind the carriage came an iron transport rig on wheels, and behind the rig, or rather fighting it the whole width of the road, came the horse. He was enormous. 17 hands, perhaps a finger over, and his coat was the color of old rust. A dark, burning chestnut that took the thin October light and turned it into something that looked hot to the touch. His mane was long and matted with burrs. Mud had dried in plates along his belly. He threw his head sideways with such force that the nearest handler lost his footing entirely, boots skidding across wet stone, and was dragged the better part of a yard before he let go of the rope and scrambled clear on his hands and knees. The crowd fell back another 10 paces. A baker tipped a whole tray of rolls into the gutter and did not look at them. "That's Lord Selmere's new stud," a woman said near Nora's stall, in the flat whisper people use for news they are enjoying. "Bought him off a regiment down in Kent. They say he finished a farrier." Finished him? Broke the man's hip in 2 places. Went through him like a gate. Nora said nothing. She watched. She watched the way the ears lay. She watched the whites of the eyes and the way the nostrils opened and shut, and where the sweat had gathered along the flank in dark rivers. She watched the horse swing his head to the left and then check himself, a small hitch in the movement, as though the swing had reminded him of something, and he had decided against finishing it. The carriage door opened, and a tall man in a dark gray frock coat stepped down onto the cobbles. Adrian Caudry, Earl of Selmer, was younger than most people expected, 36 at the outside, with a hard jaw and deep-set eyes that always looked to be measuring something. He wore no hat, which the older women found improper, and his boots were the boots of a man who spent more hours in a stable yard than in a drawing room. "Hold him," he called, and his voice carried without seeming to rise. "Get the chain onto the post ring." "We're trying, my lord." The head handler's face had gone the color of raw liver. "He won't stand long enough." The sentence ended in a crack. The stallion came up against his bindings, front hooves crashing down onto the iron frame with a sound like a smith's hammer, and the bolts on the left restraining bar groaned and bent outward. He screamed again, that terrible chesty sound, and threw his whole weight forward. The lead rope parted. The crowd broke apart like water round a stone. A cart of turnips went over. 2 constables came out of the fleece at a run, saw the size of what was loose, and arrived instantly at the shared conclusion that their best contribution would be to stand very still. The stallion stood alone in the middle of Marlbury Market Square, with a yard of broken rope swinging from his neck. He was blowing hard. His ears were flat to his skull. Every muscle along him was drawn up tight, and his hooves struck the cobbles in short, furious stamps, and he swung his head left and right, hunting for the thing that was going to hurt him next, daring the whole world to come within reach. Lord Selmer stood very still beside his carriage. His face had not changed, but his gloved hand had closed on the doorframe hard enough to whiten the leather. "Nobody move," he said quietly. Nobody did, except Nora. She would never be able to explain it afterward, and she would be asked. She did not decide. Her hands moved before her thoughts caught up with them. She reached under the counter of her stall to the shelf where she kept the old stock, the bundles gone, too brittle or too gray to sell at full price, and her fingers closed on a crushed handful of lavender. The stems snapped as she lifted them. The flowers had faded to a dusty, exhausted purple. It was worth a halfpenny, and only to somebody desperate. She stepped out from behind the stall. One of the constables hissed, "Miss, get back." She did not hear him, or she heard him and it did not signify. She walked out across the empty cobbles toward the shaking, furious animal in the middle of the square. And as she walked, she began to whistle. It was low, so low that anyone standing more than a few yards off heard nothing at all. 2 notes slow, repeating, rising and falling and rising, more hum than whistle. The sound a woman makes over a cradle when she has stopped bothering with the words. The stallion's ears twitched. His stamping slowed. Nora kept walking. She held the crushed lavender out ahead of her, on a flat open palm, the arm extended but not stiff, the elbow soft. She did not look him in the eye. Her gaze rested somewhere near his left shoulder, unfocused, as though she were looking at something a long way behind him. His nostrils opened. He caught the scent of the lavender, and something deep inside the great body shifted, a loosening, a fist coming slowly unclenched. His head came down. The rope of muscle along his neck softened. He took 1 step, then another. Then he put his muzzle into her open hand. The square went entirely silent. He stood there breathing into her palm, his eyes half shut. Nora's free hand came up and rested against the flat plane of his cheek. She went on whistling, the same 2 notes, and the stallion let out a long, shuddering breath, like a man setting down a load he has carried further than he meant to. 40 seconds. That was the whole of it. 40 seconds, and the animal that had emptied a market square stood as quiet as a church pony under the hand of a woman who sold dried flowers for a living. Selmer stared. The handlers stared. Marlbury stared. And then, before anyone could speak to her, before anyone could ask her name or catch her sleeve or demand an explanation, Nora Redfern drew her hand gently away, tucked the crushed lavender back into her apron pocket, and stepped sideways into the crowd. She was between the stalls in a moment, gone in 3. She left behind nothing but the faint smell of dried flowers and a horse standing perfectly still for the first time in 11 months. Selmer's mouth opened. It shut again. He turned to the man at his shoulder. "Find her," he said. The horse would not move. They tried everything a stable yard can try. They brought oats in a brass bucket, and he ignored them. They brought apples, and he ignored those too. A young groom of about 18, who had gone through the whole morning wanting to be brave in front of somebody, came at him from behind with a rope halter and got within a yard before the stallion kicked backward and split a water barrel clean along the stave. The boy did not try again. The horse stood precisely where Nora had left him, in the center of Marlbury Market Square and refused every hand that came near. By 2 o'clock a crowd had formed again. A different sort of crowd, the sort that arrives once the danger has settled into an entertainment. Boys hung off the churchyard railings. The landlord of the Fleece brought chairs out for the ladies. Somebody was selling roast chestnuts. At 2:30, Elias Gaunt arrived. He had ridden down from Brackenhall on a thick brown cob, and he came into the square the way a man comes into a room he has already decided he does not like. 22 years he had been stud groom to the Caudrys, 11 of them under the present Earl's father, and there was not much left in the handling of horses that he expected to be surprised by. He was 58, broad through the shoulder, gray in the whisker, with small, deep eyes under heavy brows that seemed to have been drawn together permanently at some point in the last decade and never released. My lord. He swung down. I came as soon as the boy reached me. He won't be led. He'll be led, Gaunt said. He took a rope from the nearest handler and walked out across the cobbles. What the crowd saw was a big, unhurried man crossing an open square. What was actually happening was a little different, though nobody in Marlbury that afternoon had any reason to look for it. Gaunt did not walk straight at the horse. He walked to the gutter first, and then along it, and the outside edge of his right boot stayed in contact with the raised stone curb the whole way, sliding, never quite lifting clear. When the curb ran out at the pump, he stopped for a moment, and his hand went out and found the pump handle and rested on it, and then he set off again on a new line. He came up on the stallion's near side, put out his left hand for the head collar, and misjudged it by perhaps 4 inches. His knuckles brushed the horse's cheek instead. Corunna went up. Gaunt got his weight back, and his feet under him faster than a man of his age had any right to, but the shoulder caught him anyway, and he sat down hard on the cobbles with the whole of Marlbury watching. The rope skittered away across the stone. Somebody laughed and then thought better of it. The stallion did not follow him down. That was the thing Selmyr noticed, standing on the steps of the Fleece with his arms folded. The horse had every chance and every reason, and he did not take it. He came down onto all 4 feet, back 2 paces, and stood there trembling with his ears pinned and his eyes rolling, waiting to be hurt. Gaunt got up. He collected his hat, brushed the grit from the crown, and set it back on his head. "He wants the woman," he said. "I beg your pardon, whatever she did to him." Gaunt's voice was perfectly level, and he did not look at the Earl while he spoke. He was looking at the horse, or in the direction of the horse. "He wants her back. Till she comes, that animal's not going anywhere, and I'll not lose a man's ribs, proving otherwise. You're telling me my stud groom of 22 years cannot lead a horse across a market square? I'm telling you nobody here can, my lord. That's a different sentence." Selmyr looked at him for a long moment. Then he came down the steps. "Colton," he said to the thin man with the notebook, "did anybody get her name?" "I've asked among the stallholders, my lord. Several know her by sight. A Miss Redfern, I believe. She keeps us herb stall on market days. Dried flowers, tisanes, poultices, that class of trade. Lives somewhere in the lower lanes." Colton turned a page. "Nobody seems certain of the door. Then I shall find it myself." Colton blinked. "My lord?" But Selmyr was already walking. The offer came before he did. Nora had got the stall packed and the barrow home and the shutters closed, and she was on her knees at the hearth coaxing a fire out of 3/4 of nothing when the knock came. It was not the Earl. It was a horse dealer. He gave a name, Tarrant or Tarrant, and she did not believe it. And he stood in her doorway with his hat off and a leather roll under his arm and told her he had a proposition of the most agreeable kind. He had heard about the square, marvelous business, quite the talk of the town. "You'll not want my custom," Nora said. "I sell chamomile. You misunderstand me, madam. It isn't your chamomile I want." He smiled. He had a very good smile, worn smooth with use. "I'd like you to put a word to Lord Selmere on my behalf. I'm authorized to offer double what he paid for that animal. Double in coin. This afternoon, no questions raised as to condition." Nora stood with the poker still in her hand. "Double," she said. "Double. You've not seen this horse. I've seen enough of him. You've not seen his feet. You've not seen his teeth. You've not asked me whether he's sound in the wind, and you've not asked what he did to a farrier in Kent." She set the poker down. A man who offers double for a horse he hasn't looked at isn't buying a horse. The smile stayed exactly where it was, which she found more instructive than if it had slipped. "You've a suspicious turn of mind, madam. I've a cheap one. It costs nothing." She put her hand on the door. "Good afternoon." He was gone 20 minutes when the second knock came. She opened the door 6 inches and looked out at the Earl of Selmere, standing in the dark of a dead-end lane in a coat that cost more than the house behind her, with mud to the ankle and his hat in his hand. She had changed out of her market apron. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and her hands were stained yellow and purple to the second knuckle with flour dye, and she made no attempt to hide them. She was 31, with a face more interesting than pretty. Strong brows, a firm mouth, gray eyes that held on his without any particular hurry. "My lord, you know why I've come. Your horse won't walk, and you think I'm the reason. I don't think it. I watched it." He turned the hat once in his hands. "That animal has thrown every handler I've hired. He broke a rope rig built to hold draft oxen. And you crossed 40 feet of open cobbles with a fistful of dead flowers, and he put his nose in your hand like a lamb. I should like to know how, but I find I want something else more urgently, which is, I want you to come to Brackenhall." Behind her, the fire had finally caught. She could feel the small heat of it against the backs of her legs. "He was frightened," she said. "That's all it was. Frightened animals aren't dangerous because they want to be. They're dangerous because nobody's troubled to ask them what's wrong. And you asked him, after a fashion." £5 a week, Selmere said. "Board and lodging. Full run of the stables. I need him fit to be ridden and fit to be shown to the Army's Remount Commission before the spring. £5 a week. It was more than she cleared in 2 months of dried flowers. It was the back rent on this cottage 3 times over. It was boots before the winter, and meat more than once a week, and an end to counting candle, ends like sovereigns. Nora did not let a single line of her face move. "One condition," she said. "No chain goes on that horse while he's mine to answer for. No curb bit, no hobbles. No whip in the yard, not carried, not shown. If your men can't hold to that, I'll not come. Done." You agreed to that very quickly. I've spent 400 guineas discovering that the other way doesn't work. He put his hat on. "We leave at first light. Pack what you need, Miss Redfern." She had her hand on the latch to close the door, and she stopped. She had not told him her name. He was already turning away up the lane, and he did not look back, and she stood in the 6-inch gap of her own doorway with the firelight behind her and the cold coming in, and watched him go until the dark took him. Brackenhall showed itself all at once, the way the great houses of that country do, at the turn where the Elm Avenue breaks and the ground falls away. Nora had heard of it. Everyone in Wiltshire had. But hearing of a place and coming up the drive toward it are 2 different things. And what struck her first was not the size of the house, but the quiet of it. Pale stone, a long front, tall windows taking the last of the October light. Ivy grown thick along the east wing, and behind the ivy, shutters closed. A dozen windows on that side, and every one of them dark and latched from within. Beyond the house stood the stable block, red brick, a clock tower over the central arch, room in it for 30 horses. There were 11. She counted them on the way through the yard, out of habit, and she did not comment. She noticed other things too, because she could not help it. The muck heap was well kept. The water troughs were clean, and the leathers on the near wall had been soaped that week. Whatever else was wrong at Brackenhall, the horses in it were properly done by, and that told her something about Elias Gaunt before he had said a word to her. He was waiting at the arch with his men lined up behind him. Miss Redfern. Lord Selmere came out of the carriage house, pulling off his gloves. "You've met Mr. Gaunt, in a manner of speaking. This is Mr. Colton, who keeps my accounts and most of my appointments. Sam Wicklow, second man, Toby Lark." Colton was thin, careful, 40-odd, with a notebook in his coat and the flat, unbothered courtesy of a man who has learned that opinions are expensive. Wicklow was broad and slow-spoken and looked at Nora the way a man looks at weather he has not decided about yet. Toby Lark was 17, all wrists and Adam's apple, with a cap he kept taking off and putting on again. He was also, Nora noticed, the only person in that yard who did not look surprised. Every other man there had spent the morning being told that a herb seller from Marlbury was coming to handle the horse that had broken a farrier, and every other man there wore it on his face. The boy simply stood and nodded to her, and put his cap back on, as though she were an item on a list he had been carrying about with him for some while. She filed it away and thought no more of it for 3 months. "The rig's coming up the drive now, my lord," Wicklow said. They heard Corunna before they saw him. He had traveled quietly enough as far as the gates, because Nora had walked the first 2 miles out of Marlbury with one hand on his shoulder before she would consent to sit in the carriage at all. But the yard was new, and the smells in it were new, and by the time the transport rig came under the arch, his head was up, and his ears were going like signal flags. Gaunt turned to the nearest groom. "Ropes." "I wouldn't," Nora said. He did not look round. "Beg pardon? He doesn't know this place. A rope on him now will teach him that this is where the rope happens." She stepped past him unhurried. "Give me 10 minutes, and he'll walk in on his own feet. I have run this yard for 22 years. I know. Your leathers are better soaped than the Royal Mews, and your muck heaps turned proper, which is more than I can say for most." She said it without any edge at all, which was somehow worse. "It isn't your yard I'm arguing with. It's the rope." Gaunt's face went the color of the brick behind him. He turned to the Earl, plainly expecting to be backed. Selmere folded his arms and said nothing whatever. So Gaunt took a lead rope himself and walked at the rig, and this time he did it fast, and he raised his voice. One hard bark of command that came off the yard walls, and Corunna went off like a charge in a chimney. The stallion hit the end of his chain, came round and slammed both hind feet into the iron frame. Wicklow got a hand on Toby's collar and hauled him back. A groom dropped his rope and simply ran. The rig rocked sideways on its wheels, and one of the retaining pins jumped its socket. "Enough," Nora said. She walked past Gaunt without looking at him, which he would remember for a long time, and she went to the side of the rig, and she put her open hand flat on the horse's chest. Not the face, not the neck, the broad, hard plate of the chest, where the heart comes closest to the surface. And then she did nothing at all except breathe. She breathed slowly and evenly and audibly, and she let her hand stay where it was. And the horse's ribs went on heaving against her palm at twice her rate, and then at half again, and then, somewhere past the count of 20 at hers. The kicking stopped. The screaming came down to a snort, and then to nothing. Corunna dropped his head and leaned his weight forward into her hand as though it were the only solid object left in a world that kept moving underfoot. She reached up with her other hand and unclipped the chain from his head collar. Then she turned her back on him and walked toward the open stable door, not calling. not looking round, not pulling anything at all. He followed her like a dog. The yard was entirely silent as the flower seller led the unrideable horse into his box with no rope, no chain, and no raised voice. And there was one moment in it that only two people saw. Halfway across the cobbles, Nora's left hand came up to smooth the mane out of his eyes, and her fingers passed over the crest of his neck. The stallion flinched as though she had put a coal against him. It was over in an instant. He steadied and walked on, and she took her hand away and put it on his shoulder instead, and thought, old raingulls then. Somebody's had a running martingale on him and hauled at it. She was wrong about that for the better part of 8 months. Out on the cobbles, Elias Gaunt got up off his knees, retrieved his hat, and walked to the tack room without a word. His hands hung at his sides, and the knuckles had gone the color of old bone. The stable clock struck 6, and there was frost on the paddock rail. Nora had been awake since 4. She had dressed in the dark, in the little room over the kitchen wing, pulled on a pair of riding boots the housekeeper had turned out of a chest, half a size too large and stuffed at the toe with rag, and crossed the yard with a canvas satchel over her shoulder. The satchel held the whole of her trade. Small cloth pouches, each one different, chamomile, balm, dried apple peel, and a mixture of crushed sage and meadowsweet she had been making up since she was 14 years old. Each pouch a different smell, each smell a different word. She opened the paddock gate and let Corunna walk through on his own. No rope, no head collar. He went out into the gray field with his head low and his ears turning, reading the ground the way a sailor reads a coast he has not been given a chart for. Nora shut the gate, sat down in the wet grass by the rail, and did nothing. This was the part that nearly everybody got wrong. They saw a difficult animal, and the whole of their instinct was to pull a rope, crack a lash, say a word, fill the silence up with authority. But the silence was where the work happened. In the silence, the horse could think. In the silence, he could arrive at his own conclusion about the woman sitting in the grass, and a conclusion a horse arrives at himself is the only kind he keeps. Corunna went round the paddock twice at a nervy trot, tail up. He stopped at the far corner and stared at a hen pheasant that came out of the hedge and snorted and stamped once and went on. On the 3rd circuit he slowed. On the 4th he stopped, 15 feet off, and turned to face her. She did not look at him. She took out the chamomile, opened it in her lap, and let the smell go across the field. Then she began to talk, not commands, not the clipped bark that stablemen use. She talked the way you talk to a child who has woken out of a bad dream, low and level and in no hurry whatever, about the frost, about the color of the mist down the valley, about a blackbird she had heard from her window, and how there had been a bird like it at a house she lived in once, years ago, that sat on the sill every morning until she brought it crumbs. The words did not matter. The rhythm did. A voice that asked for nothing and threatened nothing, and simply went on filling the space between them with something warm. He came the last 15 feet in a walk and put his muzzle over her open hand. She let him breathe the chamomile. She let him lip at it. And when his neck had softened and his breathing gone deep, she brought her free hand up and laid 2 fingers against the side of his jaw just below the ear. Press, release, press, hold 3, release. 2 short, 1 long, 2 short. 60 yards away, and 2 floors up, Adrian Caudry stood at the window of his study with a cup of tea going cold in his hand and did not move for a quarter of an hour. He had come to the window by accident, or so he told himself. He had risen early to go through the quarter's accounts, which made agreeable reading if you liked that sort of thing. And he did not. Wheat was at 40 shillings and had been for 4 years. 3 of his tenants had asked for abatements at McCulmus, and he had given them because the alternative was empty farms. The east wing had been shut since his brother's death, because a house of that size cannot be heated on hope. Everything at Brackenhall now turned on one contract, a stud arrangement with the Army's Remount Commission to be decided in the spring, and one 400 guinea stallion who had so far cost him a farrier's hip, a broken rope rig, and the dignity of his stud groom. He had glanced out of the window the way he always did, and then he had seen the hand signals, 2 fingers below the ear, the circular sweep along the jawline afterward, then the hand moving down to the crest of the neck and a pattern of pressures against it. 2 short, 1 long, 2 short before she stepped back and let the horse answer. He knew those signals. He had seen them exactly once, in the summer just gone, at the camp on Chobham Common, where the army had put 13,000 men under canvas, and the Queen had come down to look at them, and half of England had come down to look at the Queen. And among all that noise there had been an old man from Newmarket working a shell-shy artillery, gelding in a rope pen, silently, with his hands, while 3 officers watched him and asked no questions. Selmere had asked one. He had been told, civilly enough, that it was a matter of trade, and that gentlemen who wanted the trick of it generally found the price higher than they cared for. He set the tea down on the sill. Down in the paddock, she had moved to the horse's near side and was turning him through a slow figure, with nothing but her fingertips on his shoulder. Twice she stopped and gave him dried apple. Once she laughed, a quiet, unguarded sound that came up through the cold air to the open window, and put her forehead against his neck. Selmere went to his desk, drew a sheet of paper toward him, and wrote 1 line at the top of it. "Who is Honora Redfern?" He underlined it twice, folded it into his waistcoat, and went down to breakfast without answering the question, because he already had 4 months of the answer in a locked drawer, and he wanted to hear the rest of it from her. She came to the study at 8 in the evening, 3 days later, with her hands smelling of comfrey. The fire had burned low. The walls were books, floor to ceiling, and the room had that particular warmth of a house where only 2 rooms are warm. There were 2 glasses of brandy on the desk. "Sit down, Miss Redfern." She sat. She did not touch the glass. "I want to ask you something, and I would take it kindly if you answered plainly." Then asked plainly. 3 mornings ago I watched you work him in the lower paddock. You used a sequence of pressures, 2 fingers under the ear, a sweep along the jaw, 2 short, 1 long, 2 short along the crest. He turned his own glass slowly on the desk. "I have seen that once before on Chobham Common in June, and I was told it was a trade secret and that it was not for sale. I should like to know where a woman who sells dried chamomile in Marlbury learned it." The fire shifted. Somewhere far off in the house a clock struck the quarter. Nora looked at the brandy for a while. She could lie. She had been lying for 11 months, by silence, by omission, by wearing a plain brown dress and keeping her head down and letting the whole of Marlbury conclude that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman with an odd gift, a curiosity, a trick of nature. But she had watched this man agree to her terms in a dark lane without haggling, and she had watched him fold his arms in his own yard and decline to rescue his own stud groom, and she recognized the thing in his eyes now. He was not suspicious. He was waiting. "I didn't learn it from a book," she said. "There isn't one. That's rather the point of it." "No, I didn't imagine there was. It's kept out of writing on purpose. Not because it's sacred, because it's a living." She turned the glass round by the stem and did not drink. If 4 men in England can quiet a shell-shy horse without a twitch or a chain, those 4 men eat. If it's printed in a manual at 18 pence, they don't. So it goes hand to hand and mouth to ear, master to pupil. And there are perhaps 20 of us alive who have the whole of it. Us. Fergus Aldwyn taught me. He'd have been the old man you saw at Chobham. He's 4 and 70, and he can still put a gun horse to sleep standing up. She set the glass down. I was his pupil for 6 years. I came to him at 20. I was head of the ceremonial side at the Royal Mews by the time I was 7 and 20, and I held it for 4 years. Selmer did not move. Say the rest, he said. You know the rest. You've known it since Marlbury, or you'd not have had my name in your mouth before I gave it you. I know a name from a commission report. I should like the woman's account of it. Nora was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had gone flat and careful, the voice of somebody reciting a thing they have said to themselves in the dark 1,000 times and never once out loud. The 18th of November last year. The Duke of Wellington's funeral car. 12 horses in the team, black, in trappings, drawing 6.5 tons of bronze up the whole length of Pall Mall, in front of, they said, 1.5 million people. I don't know that anyone counted. She paused. I prepared that harness. I inspected every buckle, every billet, every stitch of it myself, the night before alone, between 1 and 4 in the morning. And a trace failed. A trace failed. The car went out of line at the top of the mall, and the near leader went down on the sets, and they had 60 men trying to lift a bronze carriage in front of the whole empire. Her hands lay perfectly still in her lap. It was in every paper in the country by Saturday. They blamed you. That's the part everybody assumes, and it isn't quite it. Something moved at the corner of her mouth that was not a smile. My lord, they couldn't blame me. There was nobody there to blame. I don't follow you. There is no Honora Redfern in the Royal Mews establishment. There never was. She met his eyes. There's a Wilkin Redfern, ledgered, warranted and paid quarterly, who was my father, and who had been a second horsemaster there before his hands went. When Aldwyn put me forward at 20, they told him plainly there was no place on the books for a woman. So they put me under my father's warrant, his name on the pay sheet, his name on the inspections, his name at the foot of every certificate I signed for 11 years. Selmer sat back very slowly. They didn't dismiss me, Nora said. You can't dismiss a person who isn't there. They simply stopped letting me through the gate, and there was no board to appeal to, and no rank to be stripped of, and no record anywhere in England that I had ever set foot in the place. I couldn't clear my name. I hadn't got one. The fire had gone down to coals. And here's the part: I'd sooner you heard from me than from a commission report, she said. That night, the man who came on at 1 o'clock offered to countersign the inspection with me. It's usual. 2 hands, 2 signatures. On ceremonial work, it's practically required, and I sent him away. Why? Because I inspect better when there's nobody watching me. She said it evenly. Because I was 9 and 20, and I was the best pair of hands in that yard, and I knew it. So there was no second signature on the return, and no witness to what I found and what I didn't. And when they wanted it to be one woman's carelessness, there was not one living soul who could stand up and say otherwise. She picked up the brandy at last and drank about 1/3 of it. So that's your answer, my lord. That's where I learned it, and that's what it cost. And if you want to send me back to Marlbury in the morning, I'd take it as a kindness to be told tonight. Selmer got up and went to the drawer of the side table and unlocked it, and came back and laid a folded paper on the desk between them. I have been looking for you since June, he said. She looked at the paper and did not touch it. Why? Because my elder brother was killed in '49, coming off a horse that had been certified sound, at a fence he had jumped 400 times. He sat down again. And because when I finally got sight of the Mews inquiry this summer, I found the certificate of that harness leather. It was signed by the contractor who supplied it. And it was the same house that signed my brother's horse. Nora went very still. Whose house? Read it, he said. And then tell me you still want to go back to Marlbury. The paper was a supply schedule, copied in a clerk's hand, from the Board of Ordnance. Ceremonial harness leather. Funeral car of the late Field Marshal His Grace, the Duke of Wellington. Supplied under contract, Stourton and Fell, horse contractors and leather factors, Liverpool Road, Islington. Nora read it twice. "I know the name," she said. "Everybody in the trade knows the name. They hold remount contracts with 3 cavalry regiments and half the artillery. If you buy a horse for the Queen's service between here and Newcastle, there's a fair chance Randall Stourton has had his hand on it first, and his signature on my brother's certificate. That proves nothing, my lord, and you know it. A man who supplies 4,000 horses a year will have signed for a few that went wrong." She folded the paper along its old crease and gave it back to him. "That's not an accusation, that's an accident of arithmetic. You disappoint me. I had hoped for indignation. Indignation is what got me put out of the Mews." She stood up. "I made an allegation about that leather in the October. 3 weeks before the funeral. I wrote it out fair, and I put it in. And it went into a drawer, and I never heard another word of it. And then a trace failed, and I was the careless woman who inspected alone." She pushed her chair in neatly. "So no, I've not much appetite for indignation. I've an appetite for evidence, which is a slower food." "Then let us make a bargain," Selmer said. "Bring that horse to the Remount Commission in March, sound, quiet, and fit to be ridden by a man who is not you. If you do it, I will use every acquaintance I have to get the Mews inquiry reopened, and I will pay for the copying of every certificate Stourton and Fell has signed in this county for 10 years. And if I fail, then Brackenhall very likely goes to the mortgages, and I shall be in no position to help anybody, including myself." He said it without any drama at all, which was how she knew it was true. "You'd best not fail." She held out her hand, and after a moment he took it, and neither of them made anything of it. She rewrote the yard the following morning, and she did it in the worst possible way, which was quietly and correctly, and in front of everybody. No lunge whip in the school, no twitch on any horse for any procedure without her present. Feeds down to 3.5 from 4, because Corunna was being fed like a hunter in full work, and was doing the work of a caged bird. Turn out every day regardless of weather, and the box at the end of the East Range would have a solid door to be fitted with a grill so the horse could see down the aisle. Elias Gaunt heard the whole of it, standing at the tack room door with his arms folded. "Anything else, Miss Redfern?" "Yes. The tack room's to be locked at night." That was the sentence that did the damage, and she knew it as she said it, and she said it anyway. "There's been no lock on that door in 22 years. There's been no horse like that one in it either. And who keeps the key? I do." Sam Wicklow, who had been mending a girth on the bench and taking care to appear deaf, looked up at that. Toby Lark stopped sweeping. "So you'll check the leathers yourself," Gaunt said. "Every night?" "Yes. No second man on it. No." Gaunt made a small sound in his throat that might have been a laugh in a better mood. "Well," he said, "you'll be very sure of yourself then when something goes wrong." He went out into the yard. Nora stood in the tack room with the key in her hand and the smell of neatsfoot oil around her, and heard the echo of the exact thing she had said in a Mews harness room 14 months earlier, in the same voice, to a man who had been trying to help her. She did not put the key down. Selmer raised it with her that evening, mildly, over the accounts. He could put a man on the yard at night. 2 shillings the week. No trouble at all. "There's no need," she said. "You are quite certain." "I'm certain that a man sitting on a bench outside a locked door sees nothing and hears nothing and gives everybody a comfortable feeling for 2 shillings. She did not look up from the feed book. "I'll check them myself. I know what I put on the hooks, and I know how I hang it." He let it go. Afterward he was not able to satisfy himself as to why. November went by, and then most of December, and the horse changed. It happened the way it always happens, which is to say invisibly and then all at once. In the first week, he would not stand tied for grooming. In the third, he stood for 20 minutes with his eyes half shut while Nora took 11 months of burrs out of his tail, a knot at a time. In the fourth, he let Wicklow pick out a front foot. In the sixth, he came to the gate when he heard her boots on the cobbles, which is a thing horses do not do for people they merely tolerate. The men began to call it the hum, because that was what they heard when she was working a low two-note thing under her breath that never quite became a tune. Toby Lark asked her to teach him on a wet Tuesday in December, standing in the doorway with his cap in both hands and going red to the ears. She said yes at once. She had been waiting for one of them to ask. She taught him what Aldwin had taught her first, which was not a signal at all, but a way of standing. Wait even. Hands low. Shoulders turned a quarter away, breathing out slower than in. 3 days on that alone. Then the first 3 pressures the jaw, the sweep, the ear, and how they meant I am here. I am not going to, and you may, in that order. And how a horse that has been shouted at for a year will answer the third one before the other 2 if you let him. The boy was extraordinary. He had it in a fortnight. Not the shape of it, which anybody can copy, the timing of it, which is the whole thing. The half-second between the release and the reward where the animal decides. Nora watched him quiet a nervy 4-year-old in the covered school on a windy afternoon and felt the particular warmth of a craftsman who has found somebody worth giving it to. "Where'd you learn to wait like that?" she asked him. Toby went red again. "Dunno, miss. I just don't like hurrying things." "No," she said. "Nor do I." She gave him a pouch of the sage and meadowsweet out of her own satchel, which she had never done for anybody, and she thought about it afterward with pleasure for several weeks. There was one thing she could not get. She could handle the whole of him now, feet, ears, mouth, sheath, the lot. She could clip the whiskers off his muzzle with a candle and shears. But if her hand went to the crest of his neck, to the ridge under the mane where the hair grew thickest, he came off the ground. Not always. Not violently once he trusted her, but always something. A flinch, a hard sideways step, a moment when the eye went white, and he was 900 miles away in some room she could not follow him into. She tried it every few days at the end of a good session with a hand full of apple. She tried it in the dark. She tried it with the sage. In 8 weeks, she got as far as being allowed to lay her palm flat on him there for the space of one breath, and then he would sweat all over in a second, like a wall coming out in damp. She wrote it down in her own book as crest old rain damage, probable martingale or bearing rain, badly, and she made a note to have Wicklow shorten the mane in the spring so she could see the skin. And then Christmas came, and the frost got serious, and there were other things to do. She did not shorten the mane. On the 9th of January, Lord Selmere came down to the lower paddock at 9 in the morning to see the horse ridden. It was not an audience, exactly. It was Colton with his notebook, Wicklow and Toby on the rail, 2 of the younger grooms who had found reasons to be near, and Gaunt standing at the gate with his hands behind his back. But it was the first time anybody at Brackenhall would see the animal under saddle, and everybody in that yard had put money on it in one direction or another. Nora had tacked him up alone in his box 20 minutes earlier, which was her way. The saddle went on without a word said. She smoothed the blanket, set it over the withers, ran her hand down under the flap to feel the lie of it, girthed him at 3 holes, and left it there, the bridle last. The padded noseband settled across the bridge of his nose, the bit lying quiet in his mouth. He mouthed it twice and let his jaw go loose. Everything was right. She let him out into the frost, halted him in the middle of the paddock, and stood a moment with her hand on his neck. "Whenever you're ready, Miss Redfern," Selmere called. She gathered the reins, put her boot in the iron, and went up. The first 4 seconds were perfect. He shifted under her to take the weight, rounded his back, brought his head up into the willing, alert carriage of a horse who has decided that work is a good idea. Then the warmth got into it. Under the blanket, the pressure of her seat drove the wool tight against the thin skin over his withers, and whatever had dried into that wool overnight came alive with the heat and bit into him like a dozen wasps going off at once. At the same instant, the noseband, warmed by his own breath, worked by the movement, began to burn on the tender flesh above his nostrils. Corunna went rigid. His head came up so hard that the reins snapped taut and Nora's hands went with them. Then he twisted sideways with a speed no animal that size ought to have, and his back came up under the saddle, and his quarters dropped, and he began to buck in a way that flung clods of frozen turf 20 feet. She did not scream. She got one hand into the pommel and hauled with the other and rode the first 3, and then the third turned into a rear, straight up, until the sky came over sideways, and she felt herself going. She kicked her feet clear of the irons and threw herself off to the side. She hit on her left shoulder, hard, and rolled twice, and finished face down in the frost with no air in her at all. She lay there for perhaps 2 seconds, while everything went white, and then she got her hands under her and pushed up onto her knees. "Get her out of there!" "Stand where you are," Nora said. Her voice was not loud. It went across that paddock like a slap. She got up. Her left arm was not working properly, and she held it against her ribs and made no attempt to walk toward the horse. And this was the thing that Adrian Caudry would remember about her for the rest of his life, that with her shoulder wrenched and her mouth full of blood from a bitten cheek, she stood perfectly still in the middle of a field and watched. She watched him buck twice more and then stop bucking. She watched him shake his head, hard, over and over, like a dog with water in its ear. Why watched him drag his nose down the whole length of his own foreleg, twice, 3 times, scouring at it. She watched him snatch at his own flank, and then stamp, and then jam his quarters against the paddock rail and rub not the belly, not the ribs, the withers with the desperation of an animal trying to get out from under something it cannot reach. "Nose withers, nothing else. It's the tack," she said. She walked out to him with her empty hands open. He came round to face her, still stamping, foam on his mouth, the whites of his eyes showing all the way round, and he came to her. He came the last few yards at a stumbling trot and put his head against her chest and stood there shuddering. "I know," she said. "I know. Stand still now." She caught the rein one-handed and ran her fingers under the noseband, and the leather was warm and slightly greasy in a way that clean leather is never greasy. She lifted it away from the skin. Underneath, along 1.5 inches of the bridge of his nose, the hair had come up in a raised red wheal, already blistering at the crown. Her face changed then, and several people saw it. She unbuckled the bridle and let it drop in the grass. She loosened the girth, pulled the saddle off left-handed, and let that drop too, and dragged the blanket clear. Then she turned it over and put it to her face. Turpentine. Sharp, unmistakable, and under it the flat, oily burn of mustard. She held the blanket up to the light. Along the underside, running fore and aft, exactly where the wool sat over the withers and nowhere else, was a thin line of discoloration about the width of a finger. Nobody puts a line like that on a blanket by accident. Nobody spills in a straight line. Nora stood in the middle of the lower paddock at Brackenhall, holding the thing in her one good hand, and turned toward the gate, and looked at the men along the rail. Colton, with his pen stopped in the air. Wicklow white to the lips, Toby Lark, with both hands over his mouth. And then at Elias Gaunt, who had not moved at all. "Somebody," she said, "has put turpentine and mustard oil into this horse's tack. On the noseband and along the blanket, on the two places where the leather touches him hardest. It was done after 9 o'clock last night, when I hung it up myself, and before 8:30 this morning, when I took it down. The frost lay white in the hollows. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Sam Wicklow, in a voice like a man dropping a plate, said, "Mr. Gaunt was in the tack room last night, past midnight. I saw the light." "So did I," said one of the younger grooms. "And I," said Toby. Everyone turned. Gaunt unfolded his arms. "That's true," he said. "I was." And then he said nothing else at all. She found the bottle in 9 minutes. That was the trouble with it. She had come back to the tack room at noon with her left arm strapped across her front, and Wicklow holding the lamp, and she had started at the door and worked round, and she had gone through the whole room the way she had been taught to go through a harness room, top to bottom, left to right, nothing skipped because it looks unlikely. Bench, hook rail, bit box, oil crock, the high shelf with the summer sheets on it, the corner cupboard where the clipping gear lived, and then Gaunt's own drawer under the bench, the one with the brass plate on it that he had put there himself in 1836, and that was never locked, because nothing in it was worth locking. And in among the hoof picks and the main comb and a coil of waxed thread, there was a small glass bottle with a cork in it, about a third full. And when she drew the cork, the smell went up her nose and made her eyes stream. Turpentine, mustard, and something else. Ground pepper, at a guess. Wicklow said. "Christ?" "Yes," Nora said. She corked it and set it on the bench and stood looking at it, and did not feel what she had expected to feel. She sat down on the mounting block outside in the cold with her arm hurting and worked it through. 9 minutes. That was the thing. Whoever had mixed that bottle knew exactly where a blanket bears and exactly where a noseband rubs, and had put 3 drops on one and a finger's width on the other, and not a smear anywhere else. That was not spite. That was somebody who understood a horse's back the way a tailor understands a shoulder. And that same person had then put the bottle in an unlocked drawer with his own name on a brass plate 4 feet from the door, in a room that was going to be searched by dinner time. A man does not do the first of those things and the second of those things, unless he wants to be caught, and Elias Gaunt did not strike her as a man who wanted anything of the kind. He struck her as a man who wanted his yard back. "Sam," she said, "how many people have been through this tack room since October?" Wicklow thought about it seriously, which she liked him for. Everybody. Grooms the farrier when he comes, the corn merchant's boy, Mr. Colton, twice a week for the feed book, her ladyship the housekeeper for the rug count. That's before you get to anyone up from the village on a hiring day, and after 9 at night, nobody, not before you came anyhow. It weren't locked, but there weren't cause. So somebody had to come in at night, in a house with 11 horses and 30 stalls, and go straight to the right hook in the dark, and know which blanket was Corunna's out of 40. She turned the key over in her fingers. The lock did no good at all, Sam. It only told me the hour. Selmyr read the whole of it that evening in the study with the bottle on the desk between them, and his face got worse by degrees. "You are telling me you don't believe it was Gaunt. I'm telling you it was too easy. There's a difference. He was in the room past midnight. 3 men saw the lamp. He has not offered one word of explanation, and when I put it to him this afternoon, he looked at the wall." Selmyr pushed the bottle an inch away from himself. "In my experience, an innocent man talks. He talks a great deal. He talks until you beg him to stop. In my experience, an innocent man talks when he has nothing worse to hide than the thing you're accusing him of." Nora shifted her arm and winced. "Give me a week. You want me to keep a man in this yard who may have crippled my stallion and broken your shoulder. It isn't broken, and yes," she stood up, "because if you turn him off tomorrow, whoever did it stops and waits, and does it again in March in front of Colonel Marchmont, and by then I'll have no idea who to watch. There was another reason which she did not give him, because it was not the kind of thing that sounds well out loud. She had spent 11 months being the obvious answer to somebody's question. The news from Sinope had come in before Christmas, and the whole country had gone off like dry gorse. 6,000 men and a Turkish squadron burned at anchor in a single afternoon, and the papers called it a massacre before the ink was dry on the dispatches. And by the second week of January, there was not a printer in England who had anything else on his front page. In the Fleece at Marlbury, they had put up a map. In the parish church at Brackenhall, the curate prayed for the fleet. And in the horse trade, quietly, the floor went up like a lift. Colton brought the figures into the state office with his usual absence of expression. A sound troop horse, 5 to 8 years, 15 and upward, had been worth £22 at Michaelmas. It was worth 34 now, and rising, and every remount contractor in England was buying anything with 4 legs and a mouth. "There will be an army in the East by the spring, my lord," Colton said. "There is no other reading of it, and the commission will be taking 3 times what they took last year, which makes March worth rather more than it was. It makes March worth the estate, my lord." Colton closed the book, if I may say so. Nora, sitting by the window with her arm in its sling, said, "It makes the horse worth more, too." Both men looked at her. 400 guineas in September, she said, for an unridable stallion out of a regiment with a reputation for breaking a farrier. That was a mad price then. It's a shrewd one now. She turned her head. And a man came to my door in Marlbury the same afternoon I first laid a hand on him and offered a double in coin without having looked at his feet. You never told me that. You never asked me, my lord, and at the time I thought he was a fool." She watched the rain come across the park. "I've had 4 months to think about it. Somebody wanted that horse before he was worth anything. Now he's worth something, and somebody has taken the trouble to make him unmanageable in front of witnesses. Those are 2 different somebodies wanting 2 opposite things. They may be," she said it slowly, "or it may be one somebody who would rather have him useless than have him anywhere at all." Colton's pen had stopped. "That," he said, "would be a very expensive preference, madam." "Yes," Nora said, "it would." She watched Elias Gaunt for 3 nights, and on the 3rd night she understood. The first night she learned nothing, except that he did not sleep. He came down from his rooms over the tack room at 12:10, went along the aisle, and was gone 40 minutes. And she lost him in the dark of the East Range and had to go back to her window. The second night she got closer, in stockinged feet inside the empty end box, and she watched him come along the aisle with a lamp in his left hand, and she noticed the first strange thing. He was counting, not aloud. His right hand went out and touched the doorpost of each box as he passed it. 1, 2, 3, 4, and at the 5th he stopped and turned in without hesitating, and that was the old bay mare's. And he stood with her a while and came out and started counting again. The 3rd night he did not carry the lamp at all. He came down the stair with his hand on the rail, went along the aisle with the outside edge of his boot against the stone curb of the drainage channel sliding, never quite lifting clear, the same way he had crossed Marlbury Market Square in front of 200 people, and turned into the tack room, and she followed him and stood in the dark by the door and watched him work. He took a bridle down off the hook. He held it at the length of his arm. Then he brought it in to about 8 inches from his face and turned it slowly, and turned it again, and his head moved with it in short tracking movements. And then he took it to the window where the moon was on the yard and did the whole thing over. He put it back. He took down the next one and did the same. He was checking the leathers. He had been checking the leathers, Nora realized, Every night since the 9th of January, since a woman had stood in his own paddock and said the word turpentine out loud in front of his men, and it was taking him 3 or 4 minutes a bridle. And there were 19 bridles on that wall, and he was doing it in the middle of the night when nobody could see how long it took. On the 4th one his thumb went over a stitched keeper and stopped, and went back over it, and stopped again. And he stood there in the moonlight with his jaw working. Nora struck a match. He came round fast, the bridle up in front of him like a man expecting a dog. "Who's that?" "You know who it is, Redfern." He lowered his arms slowly. "You've a nasty habit of standing in doorways." She lit the lamp on the bench and turned it up, and she watched what his eyes did when she turned it up. "They did nothing, Mr. Gaunt," she said. "How long?" "How long what?" "How long since you could read a newspaper?" The silence went on a long time. The lamp hissed. Out in the aisle a horse shifted in its straw and blew. 2 year, Elias Gaunt said, "thereabouts. Michaelmas after next it'll be 3. Nora sat down on the bench. "There's a cloud in each," he said. "Write one first. It come on that slow you'd not credit it a year. I thought it was the glass in my window wanted cleaning." He set the bridle down on the rail and missed the rail by 2 inches and caught it and hung it up properly on the 2nd attempt. "I see shapes, I see light and dark, and a horse against a wall. I don't see a bruise on a knee, and I don't see a girth lying crooked, and I have not seen a splinter of a crack in a hoof since the winter before last. You've hidden it for 2 years. 22 years I've run this yard. 11 under his father." He said it perfectly steadily. "I've no wife and no children and no place else, and there is no man in England who'll take on a stud groom of 58 who can't see. They'd have found me a cottage and a pension and a chair, and I'd have sat in that chair with the yard 50 yards off and listened to somebody else get it wrong. So you come down at midnight. I come down at midnight, because at midnight nobody sees me count." He turned his face toward the sound of her voice, not quite at her, a little past her left shoulder. "Every doorpost, every hook, 22 paces from the stair to the tack room door, and 11 from the door to the corn bin. And if a lad leaves a barrow in the aisle in the daylight, I go over it in front of the whole yard, and they think the old man's had a drink. And on the night of the 8th, I was here till gone one, checking them. Same as tonight." His mouth twisted, and a fat lot of good it did, "because I'd not have seen a line of oil on a blanket if you'd painted it green, and I could not have smelled it neither, not with a tack room full of turpentine soap. So no, Miss Redfern, I did not tell his lordship where I was and what I was doing, because the answer is that I was standing in this room holding the very blanket in my 2 hands, and I never knew." The lamp hissed. "That's why you'd not defend yourself," Nora said. "I'd sooner be a villain than a blind man." He said it without any self-pity at all, as a plain statement of the market rate. A villain gets turned off. A blind man gets sat down. Nora looked at the 19 bridles on the wall, and at the 4th one, and got up and took it down and ran her thumb across the keeper he had been worrying at. The stitching was sound. It was a new keeper on an old bridle, and the wax stood proud of it, and any pair of eyes in England would have seen that in a half-second. She hung it back on its hook. "You went at him in the square," she said. "In Mulberry."
"You went at him fast and loud." "Aye."
"Because you'd misjudged the distance, and you knew it, and you thought noise would carry you the last 2 feet. Elias Gaunt did not answer that for a while. "You stood off him 30 foot, he said at last, and told them where he was hurting. In January. You got throwed on the frozen ground, and you got up, and you never went a step nearer him, and you said it's the tack, and you were right." He picked up his hat off the bench, found it first time, and put it on. "I've hated you since October, and I'd like to tell you it was because you're a woman, or because you sell posies. because that'd be a cleaner thing to hate anybody for. But it isn't. No, he said, you can see him and I can't. He went out into the aisle, and she heard the edge of his boot find the curb and heard it go away from her, 22 paces, and the stair door. Nora sat in the tack room a long while with the lamp turned down. She had her innocent man. She had lost her only suspect, and the thing that had done it was still in the house. It was Toby Lark who caught Colton, which was the sort of joke the years seemed to enjoy making. The boy had been sent up to the estate office on the last Friday in January with the week's forage returns, and he had come down again white-faced and had gone straight to the tack room instead of the office, and had stood in front of Nora, turning his cap over and over. "Miss, I don't want to say a thing about a gentleman." "Then don't say it about a gentleman. Say it about what you saw." "There's a letter half wrote on Mr. Colton's desk." He swallowed. "It's got the horse in it. It says the chestnut is now backed and quiet, is being ridden daily, and in my judgment will pass the commission. And it's got the price of our hay in it, and what his lordship give for the 2-carriage horses at Devise's, and it ain't to his lordship's lawyer, miss, because I've took letters to his lordship's lawyer, and they don't start, 'Dear sir, yours of the 12th to hand.'" Nora put down the girth she was mending. "Who's it to?" "Didn't dare look, miss. There was an envelope, but it was face down." She thought for a moment. "Go and finish your stalls," she said. "Say nothing to anybody, including Mr. Wicklow, especially Mr. Wicklow. He can't keep his face straight." Peveril Colton did not deny it. That was the first surprise. The second was that he had been doing it for 19 months. He stood in the study with his hands at his sides and gave the whole account in the same flat voice he used for the corn bills. A firm of insurance brokers in Cornhill paid him 2 guineas a month for what he called intelligence, and what everybody else in the room called the private business of his employer. Rents, stock, prices given, prices got, the condition of the house, whether the east wing was shut. There were 11 gentlemen's houses in Wiltshire on the same arrangement. He was not, he wished it understood, unusual. "You are aware of what you have done," Selmere said. "I am aware, my lord, that I owe £412 to a man in Salisbury, and that I have owed it since the autumn of '51, and that I have paid 2 guineas a month against it for 19 months, and that if you were to ask me tonight whether I would do it again, I should have to answer you honestly." Colton took off his spectacles and polished them. "I have never touched a horse in my life, my lord, except to be helped onto one. I did not put oil in that blanket. I would not know which end of a blanket to put it in." "Do you know," Nora said, "who else has had that intelligence?" Colton looked at her. "I do not, madam. That is rather the point of a broker. He was gone by Monday with a month's wages and no character." And Nora stood at the yard arch and watched the cart take him down the drive and felt no satisfaction of any kind. She had wanted a villain and had been handed a bookkeeper. But she understood one thing better afterward. Every man in England who cared to spend 2 guineas had known, since December, that the unrideable horse at Brackenhall was becoming rideable. That evening she did a thing she had not done since she was 19 years old. She finished the night check on the leathers, went to the corn bin where Elias Gaunt was standing, because standing near the corn bin was what he did when he wanted to look occupied, and put the inspection book and a pencil in his hands. "What's this?" 19 bridles, 4 saddles, 6 sets of driving harness, the lunge cavesson and the 2 rugs in use. Checked at 9:30. She kept her voice ordinary. "I want a second name against it." Gaunt held the book. He did not open it, because he could not read it. "You know I can't see a word of that. You can put your name at the foot of it. And you can put your hands on every strap in this room before you do, and you will find things I don't. Because you've had your hands on some of them for 20 years, and I've had mine on them for 3 months. She paused. And if anything goes wrong, there'll be 2 of us who checked it, which is 1 more than there was in November of '52. Gaunt was quiet for a moment. Where do I sign? Bottom left. I'll put your thumb on the line. He signed it. His signature came out running slightly downhill, which it did every night for the next 8 months, and Nora never once straightened the book for him. Lord Selmere went up to London on the 9th of February and came back on the 12th in a state she had not seen in him. He had gone to the War Office about the March Commission and had spent 2 days in corridors, and on the second afternoon, in the outer hall of the Ordnance Department, a man had come across the marble and put out his hand and said his name as though it were a pleasure he was conferring. Randall Stourton was 54, comfortable, beautifully turned out in a way that never quite came off as vain, with the sort of face that makes strangers feel they have met him before. He held remount contracts with 3 regiments of cavalry and 2 batteries. He had, he said, followed the Brackenhall business with the greatest interest. He knew everything, Selmere told her, standing at the study fire, with his coat still on. He knew the horse was backed. He knew you had been thrown in January. He knew, Miss Redfern, that the animal had been shod on the 16th. Colton's brokers. Very likely. He turned round. He offered me 1,200 guineas. Nora sat down. 3 times, she said. 3 times cash. Drawn that afternoon on Coots, and he wanted no warranty of any kind. No vetting, no trial. He would take him as he stood in a way that week. Selmer's jaw moved. And he never asked me one question about the horse. Not his age, not his height, not what he did to the farrier in Kent. He asked after your health, and he asked whether the animal was still in his old shoes, and that was the whole of his curiosity. What did you say? I said no, and I said it badly, because I was angry and because I have a mortgage of £9,000, and a man was offering me 1,200 for a horse I had bought for 4. He rubbed his face. He took it very well. He said he quite understood a gentleman's attachment. He said the offer would stand until the commission, and after the commission it would not stand at all. That's the part that matters. Yes. Because after March, if the horse passes, he's worth 1,200 to the army, and Stourton could have him honestly. Nora was looking at the fire and not at him. So he isn't buying a horse to sell. He's buying a horse to have. And a man who wants to have a horse doesn't stop wanting it because the price went up. There is one thing more. Selmer pulled off his gloves at last. He had a man with him, not a clerk the other kind, 50 or thereabouts. Very neat, had in his hand the whole while, and the best smile I have seen on a human being in some years. Stourton called him Fell, Josiah Fell, of the firm. Nora went cold from the neck down. Describe the smile. I have described it. It never moved. Was he wearing town boots? Hard heels? No nails, the sort that ring on a stone floor? Selmere looked at her. He came to my door in Mulberry in October, Nora said, and gave me the name Tarrant, and offered double for a horse he had not looked at, and told me he was authorized. And I sent him away and thought no more of it, and I have been an idiot for 4 months. The fire cracked. Then we have him, Selmer said. We have nothing at all, my lord. We have a woman who sells chamomile saying a gentleman gave her a false name in a doorway. With no witness, she stood up. You must stop wanting it to be finished. It is going to go on until March, and we had better arrange ourselves accordingly. The second attempt came on the 14th of February, and she nearly missed it. It was in the rain. The near rein of the bridle she used every day, at the point where the leather is doubled back and stitched round the bit ring, and somebody had lifted the flap of that fold and got at the seam underneath. Not with a knife, but with something else. The thread was intact, and the leather was whole. And it was only when Nora ran the fold between finger and thumb, for the 400th time in her life that she felt it give slightly, like a page coming unglued from a binding. She took it to the window. The stitching had been soaked. The old wax had been softened out of it with spirit, and the thread had gone soft and gray and slack, and it would have held for a week and let go on the 8th day at the bit ring, which on a horse at speed means a rein in your hand attached to nothing at all. She stood with it for a long time. Nobody had come into the yard. The lock had held. The window was barred. Gaunt had had his hands on the same bridle at 9:30 and signed for it, and she trusted Gaunt now, which was not a thing she could have said at Christmas. So the person doing this was inside Brackenhall, was there in daylight, had a reason to be near that tack room, and knew which bridle she used. Nora did not tell Lord Selmere. She had a reason for that too, and she was not proud of it. He would have turned off the whole yard and sat a watchman on the door, and she would have learned nothing and had 6 months to think about it. Instead, she went to her room and got out her mortar. Madder root, ground fine, slaked lime, a little alum. It was the oldest dye in the trade, and any village in England could make it. And Nora Redfern had been making it since she was a girl, because madder is what you use when you want a red that does not shift. And the useful thing about it, the thing she had known since she was 11, and had come home with her hands stained to the wrist and been beaten, for it was that in the presence of lime and warm water it does not stay pale. She ground it to a flour so fine it moved like smoke. She worked it into a mixture of chalk and a very little neatsfoot until it was a dry colorless dust that would not show on leather and would not smell. Then she waited for a wet Wednesday, when the whole yard was in and the stove in the tack room was going, and she dusted the underside of every rein, every girth, every cheek piece, and every blanket in that room. Working alone with the door shut for 2 hours, she told one person. "Warm water," she said, "that's all it wants. Cold does nothing. Warm water on the skin and it comes up pink, and then red, and it stays for 2 days, and it doesn't scrub out." Elias Gaunt sat on the bench with his hands on his knees. "And if it's a lad that washes his hands in the trough, then he'll get nothing, and I've wasted a wet Wednesday. But he won't." She was putting the mortar back in her bag. "Whoever it is has been getting oil and spirit on his fingers for a month. He washes properly, and he washes hot, because he's frightened of the smell." Gaunt was quiet for a while. "You've a cold way of thinking, Miss Redfern," he said, "for a woman that sits in wet grass talking to horses about birds." "It's the same thing," Nora said. "You watch, and you don't help, and you let the animal come to you." She hung the last cheek piece back on its hook and turned the lamp down and went out into the rain. It came up on Friday morning in the scullery of the groom's cottage. In a basin of water the cook had drawn off the copper at 6, and by the time the boy noticed the color in it, he had both hands in to the wrist, and the stain was under his nails and into the creases of his knuckles and across the base of both thumbs, a clear soft rose that darkened while he stared at it. Nora watched him through the scullery window for a full minute before she went in. He had got the basin tipped into the drain by then, and was at the pump with the handle going and his hands under the spout, scrubbing at them with a scrap of sacking, and the water was ice cold and did nothing whatever. And he was scrubbing harder and harder and harder in a way that she recognized from a dozen frightened animals, the movement of a creature that has understood the situation and has nothing left but movement. She opened the door. "Toby." He stopped. He did not run and he did not lie. He stood with the pump handle in one hand and his ruined red fingers spread in front of him, and looked at them, and then at her, and his face came apart all at once, the way a boy's face does. "I never meant the horse to be hurt," he said. "You put mustard oil under his saddle." "I never knew what it was." It came out of him at a shout, and then dropped straight away to nothing. "I never knew, miss. It come in a bottle in a parcel, and the letter said, "Put 3 drops in the noseband and a line under the blanket where it sits." And I thought it was to make him fidget, to make him go bad in front of his lordship. I never knew it burned him till I seen him at the rail. He was crying now, which he plainly hated. I seen the blisters when you took it off. I was sick behind the barn. And the rain, spirit of wine, under the fold. He wiped his face with his forearm and left a smear of pink across his cheek. That one I did know. I knew what a rain going means. I done it anyway. Nora stood in the scullery doorway with the cold coming off the flagstones and made herself say the thing evenly. "You are 17 years old, and you have a better pair of hands than any man in that yard, and you have been putting spirit into the reins of a horse you helped me feed." She waited. "Why?" Toby Lark took a breath. "Because if I don't," he said, "the money stops." He fetched them from under the boards of his room over the hay store, a tin box with a hasp, and in it a bundle of letters done up in twine, 17 of them, and a folded page of accounts in a child's careful arithmetic, recording what had come and what had been sent on. They went to the tack room because there was a stove and a door. Nora made him sit down. She did not touch the bundle for a moment. "Start at the beginning." The beginning was a room in Southwark, off Red Cross Street, and a cooper named Lark who had gone to work in August of '53 and been dead by the Saturday. Cholera took the whole of that court that month. They had it in the papers as a visitation and in Southwark as a smell. His mother had 2 younger children, and no trade of her own and no claim on anybody. Toby had come down into Wiltshire in September, because a man at the hiring told him there was a place at Brackenhall, and the place had paid £9 the year and his keep, and £9 the year does not feed 3 people in Southwark. In October, the first letter had come. "There's no name on any of 'em," he said. "Never was. It come to me at the Fleece in Mulberry. Not here I'm to walk in on market day and ask, and there's a letter, or there ain't. First one had 30 shillings in it, and it said, 'This is for your mother, and there'll be the like every month, and there'll be small services asked, and you'll do them, and you'll not ask questions. And if you speak of it to any person, the money stops that day.' And the first small service was to say if anyone come near the chestnut." He looked at the floor. "That were before you, miss. Weeks before. I were to write if there was any person come to handle him particular. A trainer or a dealer," or he stopped. Or a woman," Toby said. The stove ticked. "That's why you weren't surprised," Nora said. "In the yard. In October. Every man there had been told a herb seller was coming, and every man there had his mouth open, and you nodded to me like I was a parcel you'd been expecting. I'd had it in my head since September, miss. If a woman comes near that horse, write directly." His voice went thin. "I thought it were only buying and selling. I thought it were some dealer wanting to know his chances. I wrote it that same night, and I got £2 extra in the next one, and I sent it home, and I never thought about it again till January." Nora untied the twine. The letters were all the same. A single half-sheet, folded, no address at the head, and no name at the foot. The paper was cheap. The ink was cheap. The hand was small and very regular. The hand of a man who had been taught to write in a copybook and had gone on writing that way for 50 years, sloping a little, with the tail of the Y turned back under, and a habit of finishing a line with a small hard stop like the tap of a nail. Nora looked at the first one for a long time. Then she looked at the second, and at the 7th, and at the last one, which had come 3 weeks ago, and said that if the animal went to the commission in March, it would be as well if he did not arrive. "Miss?" She did not answer him. She was 31 years old, and she was looking at a hand she had seen every night of her childhood, on the inside cover of a stud book, on the backs of feed bills, on the letter that had come to her school in Norfolk to say that her mother had died, and that she was not to worry about the expense. That tail on the Y, that little hard stop at the end of a line. Miss Redfern, you've gone all white, give me the seals. 9 of the 17 had been closed with wax rather than a wafer. She turned them over and put them side by side on the bench and held the lamp down close, and everyone carried the same impression, small, worn on one edge, pressed off center by a hand that no longer had much strength in it, a horse's head in profile facing left with a cropped mane. She had watched that seal go into hot wax perhaps 2,000 times. It lived in a shallow brass box on the shelf beside the clock. It had been her grandfather's, and there was a nick out of the near ear where somebody had dropped it in 1804, and there was a nick out of the near ear in every one of these. "Toby," Nora said. Her voice sounded to her as though it were coming from the aisle outside. "When you wrote back, where did you send it?" "Post office at Marlbury, miss." "To a name?" "W. Esquire," said Toby Lark. "To be left till called for, at Lambeth." Nora put both hands flat on the bench. Her father had gone out of his lodgings in the first week of December 1852, 3 weeks after the funeral car went out of line on Pall Mall, and had left no direction. She had written to his sister at Swaffham, and the letters had come back. In April, a man she knew slightly from the Mews had told her, in a kindly way, in the street, that old Wilkin had died in the winter and been buried out of a lodging-house, and that it had all been done decently. She had believed him. She had gone home and sat in her cottage in Marlbury, and not been able to cry about it, and had put it away, and had thought about it perhaps once a week ever since with a dull and manageable grief. She had never seen a stone. She had never seen a register. She had never asked, because asking would have meant going back to London, and she had not been able to go back to London. "Miss," said Toby from a long way off. "Miss, is it somebody you know?" Nora Redfern looked down at 17 letters that had bought a boy's obedience for 30 shillings a month. "It's my father's hand," she said. She did not tell Lord Selmere that night or the next. She told him on the third night, in the study, and she told him all of it, and in order. And she watched him understand, and she watched him reach immediately for the wrong end of it. "Then we go to Lambeth on Monday, and we have the man." "No, Miss Redfern. If we go to Lambeth on Monday, one of two things happens." She had thought about very little else for 60 hours, and it came out of her in order, like a list. "Either there is nobody there, in which case we have frightened them, and they change the arrangement, and we are blind in March. Or there is somebody there, and he is my father, and he is arrested. And Toby is arrested with him for putting spirit in a rain. And then the man who wanted this done has lost a clerk and a boy, and nothing else in the world, and he is not so much as named in it. You are proposing to do nothing. I am proposing to do something a good deal worse." She stood up and put her hands behind her back. Toby goes on. He goes into Marlbury on market day, and he collects his letter, and he takes his 30 shillings, and he sends it home to his mother, and he answers it, and I write the answers. Selmere was quiet. He is 17. He is 17, and he has a mother in Southwark and 2 children behind her, and if that money stops in February, they are in the street by April. Nora's voice did not move. "I am not doing it to spare his feelings, my lord. If I turn him off, I lose the only line I have into that house. He is the wire, and I intend to send along it. And if they find him out, then he will have done a brave thing, and I shall have done a cold one, and I shall have to live with the arithmetic." She turned round. "I have been on the other end of this. I know exactly what it is worth to have one person inside a place who is telling you the truth." They went at it for another quarter of an hour, and she won, because she was right and because he was tired. What she did next was the part that cost her. She called them into the tack room on the Sunday evening, after the horses were done, Elias Gaunt, Sam Wicklow, Toby Lark, and Adrian Codry, Earl of Selmer, sitting on a corn bin in his own stable with his hat off, and she stood in front of the four of them and laid the whole of it out. The bottle, the rain, the dye, the letters, the 30 shillings, the name at Lambeth, Staunton's 1,200 guineas, and the man called Fell who had once called himself Tarrant. She left nothing back which was not her nature. From tonight, she said, no man handles that horse alone. Not me. Sam checks the leathers with me at 9 and Mr. Gaunt puts his hands on everyone after and signs. Toby writes what I give him to write and shows me the answer before it goes. His lordship keeps the letters in the house safe, and if any one of us is asked in a court what he saw, there will be 3 others who saw it with him. And if it's one of us 4, said Wicklow, reasonably. Then he's a fool, Gaunt said, because he's just been told the shape of the net. It isn't one of us 4, Nora said. But Sam is right to ask, and I'd not have thought of it, and that is exactly why there are 4 of us. She got them to put their names to it. A half sheet of paper, the date, 6 lines in her own writing, and 4 signatures under it. Wicklow's careful, Toby's cramped, Selmer's swift, and Elias Gaunt's running downhill with Nora's thumb on the line. She signed last. Her hand shook, and Gaunt could not see it, and the other 3 had the grace to look elsewhere. They left Brackenhall on the 26th of March with frost still in the hollows and the blackthorn just coming out white along the hedges. It was a small party by the standards of the house. Selmer rode his own bay hunter. Nora rode a chestnut mare called Birch, side saddle, in a habit borrowed and taken in at the waist by the housekeeper, because whatever else she was going to do in front of the Army's Remount Commission, she was not going to do it in a way that gave anybody an easy reason to look away. Wicklow drove the light cart with the tack and Toby's box. Gaunt came behind on his cob, and Corunna walked loose on a long rein at Nora's knee in a plain head collar, with no chain on him at all. There was one other man. Josiah Fell had presented himself at the gate on the Saturday with a letter from the firm of Staunton and Fell, contractors, appointed by the ordinance to attend the March Commission on behalf of the trade, and requesting the courtesy of traveling in company with his lordship's party, as the roads were much troubled with military traffic. It was perfectly regular. 3 other contractors had men on the plain that week. To refuse would have been remarkable in itself, and remarkable was the one thing they had agreed they could not afford. Let him come, Nora had said. I would rather have him where Sam can see his boots. He rode a good gray, and he was charming to everybody. And he tipped his hat to Nora on the first morning as though they had never met, and she tipped her head back at him in the same spirit. And neither of them said the name Tarrant. The first day went over open sheep country, past stone walls and flint cottages, and the occasional knot of laborers stopping in the field to watch them go. There was a great deal of traffic on the roads now. Wagons of hay going east, wagons of barrels going east. Twice they passed a string of remounts, 30 and 40 head, roped in 4s with a trooper at the head of each string, all moving toward the railway at Warminster, and from there, everybody knew, to Southampton and the transports. Nobody said the word war very much any more. It had stopped being a subject and started being weather. On the second morning, the road went up into the downs, and that was the country Nora had been thinking about since January. It ran narrow and chalky along the flank of a combe, with the ground falling away on the left through thorns scrubbed to a stream 60 feet below, and rising on the right in a bank of bracken and old flint. The footing was loose. There was that particular downland silence up there, wind and skylarks and nothing else that makes a nervous horse hear his own feet. Corunna's ears worked the whole way. His stride shortened and his head came up. But he kept walking, and he kept his shoulder at Nora's knee. And when a stone rolled out from under his off hind, he stopped shifted his weight back over his quarters, and went on without a break. Halfway up, a cock pheasant came out of the bracken 3 feet from his head with a noise like a rug being beaten. He came off the ground. He came off at 8 inches, twisted, landed with his quarters under him, and then Nora's hand was on his shoulder, and she said one word, and he stood blowing, with his head down and his sides going, on a chalk track 4 feet wide, with a 60-foot drop at his elbow, and after a moment he began to walk again. At the top of the pass, Selmyr had halted and turned in his saddle to watch, and he did not move for some while. Wicklow said, "To nobody, well, I'm damned." "Eh," said Gaunt from the back. "He never turned a hair, Mr. Gaunt. Bird come up right under him, and he stood there like a milk pony." "I know what he did," Gaunt said. They looked at him. 4 beats going up even as a clock, Gaunt said. Then the bird, then nothing, then 4 beats again, and the 4th one a shade long because he'd got a stone under him. He was facing the middle distance with his hat brimmed down. You can hear a frightened horse a 1/4 mile off. They go short and quick, and they go on their toe. That one's putting his heel down. He clicked his cob forward. That's a horse that's happy. You can hear it. Nobody answered him. Toby, driving beside Wicklow, wiped his face with the back of his wrist and pretended it was the wind. Selmyr fell in beside Nora as the road came off the top, and the plain opened out ahead of them, brown and enormous, with the white scars of the artillery ranges away to the south. "I have never told you," he said, "why I was in London that November. No, I was on the street, Pall Mall, on the north side, about level with the Ordnance Office." He was looking straight ahead. "I had a place at a window, and I gave it up because I wanted to see the horses. I was 40 feet from the near leader when the trace went." Nora's hand went still on the rein. "Say what you saw." "I saw a strap fail," he said, 18 inches from where it was doing any work at all. They rode a little way." "That's right," Nora said at last. Her voice had gone very quiet. "That's the whole of it, my lord. That's the thing I could never make anybody hear. Leather breaks where it bears. That trace parted 6 inches below the crest of the pad, in a piece of leather that was carrying nothing but its own weight, and there is no honest way for that to happen to a strap that a woman had had in her 2 hands at 3 o'clock that morning." "I know," Selmyr said. "I have known since November of '52, and there has not been one man in England I could say it to." She looked at him for a moment. "You have now," she said. The remount ground lay in a shallow bowl under Battlesbury, 3 miles out of Warminster, with the River Wylye running along the eastern side of it below a bank of turf. Colonel Rufus Marchmont was a spare, weathered, unhurried man of 60 who had bought horses for the Queen's service for 22 years and had a way of looking at an animal that took about 4 seconds and missed nothing. He had 6 officers with him, 3 contractors' men, a veterinary surgeon from the Ordnance, and a clerk with a table set up on trestles in the lee of a marquee. The wind came off the plain in long, cold pushes. They ran Corunna in hand first. Trot away, trot back. Turn on the near rein, turn on the off. The vet went over him for 40 minutes and found an old windgall and a 2-year-old scar on the off hind and pronounced him, in the flat voice of his profession, a very good sort of horse. "Height," said Marchmont. 17 hands 1, sir. Too big for the light cavalry and too handsome for the guns. Marchmont walked round him once. "Age? Rising 9, sir," Nora said. "And this is the animal from the Kent depot." "It is." "That broke a farrier's hip in May." "It is, sir." Marchmont looked at her for the 4 seconds. "Ride him," he said. Selmyr rode. That had been agreed. Since January, the commission would not take the word of a woman on a horse's temper, and the whole point of the exercise was to show that the animal went for somebody other than the person who had made him. He walked. He trotted, 20 minutes of it, on both reins, past the marquee and past the flapping canvas and past a line of tethered troop horses. And he did not put a foot wrong. The clerk wrote. One of the officers said something to another, and both of them nodded. Marchmont raised a hand. "Take him down the river track and let him gallop. I want to see him come back." The river track ran 200 yards along the top of the bank, flat, mown by sheep, with the turf falling away 6 feet on the left onto the shallows of the Wylye and its bed of gray stone. Selmere took him down at a canter, turned at the willows, and let him out. The change was enormous. 1,200 pounds of horse coming up the bank with the wind behind him, hooves going into the turf like a drum, mane flat back against the rider's chest, and every man at that trestle table stopped writing and stood up. Nora and Birch, at the near end of the track, watched him come and thought, there. That is what he is. That is what he was made for. And what somebody spent 2 years beating out of him. At the 11th stride, the girth let go. She heard it. Over the drumming and the wind she heard the small dry crack of it, like a stick going in a hedge, and the saddle came sideways. It went all at once. The off flap swung up. The near iron dropped. And Adrian Caudry went with it, his whole weight out over the left shoulder, over the bank, over 6 feet of nothing and the gray stones of the Wylye, with one hand still in the mane and one foot still in an iron that was no longer attached to anything. And Corunna, feeling the load lurch off his spine, did what every horse in the world does. He tried to get underneath it. He checked and swung left, toward the drop, to put himself back under the weight. Nora had Birch moving before she knew she had asked her. Afterward, she was not able to describe the next 4 seconds in a way that satisfied anybody, including herself. She was sitting sideways on a mare with her right leg hooked over a pommel and her left foot in a single stirrup, which is to say she was fastened to that saddle by friction and geometry and nothing else. And she took Birch up the outside at a flat gallop and came alongside Corunna's shoulder with the bank going past on the left, and she got her right hand off the rein and reached. She missed the rein. She got the cheek piece. She got 4 fingers behind the near cheek piece of a bridle on a horse doing 30 miles in the hour, and she was leaning out of a side saddle with her whole body past the vertical, and she hauled. She hauled with her arm and her shoulder and the whole of her back, and she sat down into Birch and asked the mare to stop at the same instant. And Birch, who was 11 years old and had spent her life pulling a governess cart and had never done anything remarkable before or after, locked her hocks under her and slid. Corunna's head came round. He fought it for 2 strides. Then he felt whose hand it was. He planted his 4 feet and skidded, tearing 4 long stripes out of the turf, and came to a stop with his chest heaving and his near forefoot 18 inches from the edge of the bank, and the ruined saddle hanging under his belly with the girth trailing from it like a dead snake. Selmer came off him sideways into the grass and lay there. Nobody moved anywhere in that bowl for about 2 heartbeats. Then everybody moved at once. Nora got down. She was shaking so hard she had to put a hand on Birch's neck to get her feet under her. And she went to the Earl first, because that was the order of things. And he was already sitting up with grass in his hair and his face, the color of a candle. "I'm not hurt," he said. See to it now before." She was already on her knees in the turf with the girth in her hands. It was the near billet that had gone, the doubled leather where the girth buckles up, stitched round the buckle plate through 4 rows of waxed linen thread. 16 threads in the row, 12 of them had been cut. They were square across, every one of them, each severed at the same shallow angle by a blade drawn along the underside of the plate where nobody looks. The other 4 had frayed and torn and come apart under load, exactly as they were meant to, on the 11th stride of a gallop. She held it up to the light with both hands, Colonel Marchmont was standing over her. He had come 150 yards at a run, and he was not breathing hard. "Show me." She showed him. He took it, turned it twice, and handed it to the veterinary surgeon without a word. "Cut," said the vet. "Yes," said Marchmont. He turned and looked at the marquee, and at the trestle table, and at 11 men standing about on a hillside in Wiltshire. "Nobody leaves this ground," he said. "Sergeant, every man here, every bag, every pocket. Begin at that end and work along, and I will have the first man who declines it in front of a magistrate this afternoon." It took 19 minutes. They found nothing in the cart, and nothing in the tack box, and nothing in Wicklow's coat, or Toby's, or Gaunt's, or the Earl's. Fell submitted with the greatest good humor, and turned out a pocketbook, a pencil, a printed schedule of the day's proceedings, and a clean handkerchief. The sergeant came to Nora last, and hesitated, because she was a woman, and Marchmont said, "All of it, Sergeant." And the sergeant said, "Beg pardon, madam," and put his hand into the pocket of her habit. He drew out a folding knife. It was Sheffield steel with a bone handle, worn smooth, the kind that any stableman in England carries for cutting twine, and the blade had a thin film of neatsfoot oil along the cutting edge, and caught in the grain of the steel, dark, barely visible until the sergeant tilted it, were 4 or 5 fibers of waxed linen thread. Nora Redfern looked at it in his open hand and said, "That isn't mine." Nobody in that bowl said anything at all. Then Josiah Fell took a step forward and removed his hat and said, "With every appearance of great reluctance, Colonel, I am extremely sorry to say this, and I would give a good deal not to. But I came up from the horse lines at about 6 this morning, and the lady was in the tack tent." "That's a lie," said Wicklow. "I hope it is," said Fell. The wind came across the plain. Marchmont looked at the knife, and at the girth, and at the woman standing on the turf with her hair coming down and her sleeve torn at the shoulder. "Madam," he said, "who inspected that girth?" "I did." "When? Last night at 9 with Mr. Wicklow and Mr. Gaunt put his hands on it after me and signed the book." "Mr. Gaunt is the man who cannot see it," said Fell gently, "as I understand the yard talk." Elias Gaunt made a sound in his throat, and Wicklow got hold of his arm. "And in November of '52, Marchmont said, and he said it quite without malice, which somehow made it very much worse, who inspected the harness of the funeral car. The whole hillside heard it. Nora stood in the wind, with her hands empty at her sides, and understood the shape of the thing all the way to the bottom, the way you understand a fall while you are still in the air. A woman put out of the Royal Mews for leather that failed. A second set of leather that failed. Herself the one thing common to both. It was not even a lie. That was the beauty of it. Every fact was true. Colonel Marchmont, Lord Selmer said, getting to his feet, "That woman has just come off a bank at a gallop to pull my horse out from under me, and if she had been half a second slower, you would be picking me off the stones. Do you propose to arrest her for it?" "No," Marchmont said. "The magistrate does that. I merely have to write it down." He gave the knife to the sergeant. They took her off the plain in a covered cart at 4 in the afternoon, along the Warminster Road, past the strings of remounts going the other way toward the railway. It was the 28th of March, 1854. By the time the cart reached the turnpike, the church bells had begun to go in Warminster, and then in the villages behind, one after another across the whole of that county, because the telegraph had brought it down from London that afternoon, and every printer in England was already setting the same 3 words for the morning. Her Majesty had declared war upon the Emperor of Russia. There was not one newspaper in the kingdom the next day that had room for anything else at all. Devizes jail in the last week of March was cold in a way that got into the joints and stayed there. She was held 13 days. They were not unkind to her. The matron brought her a second blanket on the 4th night and let her have paper and she used it to write out, from memory, every strap on every horse at Brackenhall and the date it had last been checked, because it was that or listen to the drains. Lord Selmere came twice and made everything worse both times. He came the first time with a lawyer from Salisbury, and the news that he had written to the War Office, to the Ordnance, to 2 members of the original Mews inquiry, and to a cousin in the Lords. He came the second time, 9 days later, with none of it having produced anything at all. "They are civil," he said. "They are extremely civil." Do you know what they are civil about? They are civil about the fact that a peer of the realm with £9,000 on his land is exerting himself very greatly on behalf of a woman in his employment, who is 31 and unmarried and living on his estate. He stopped. "I beg your pardon. Don't." Nora had her hands round a cup of cold tea for the heat that was no longer in it. "It's what I'd think, in their place. It's what I'd have thought at 9 and 20. There is a report going round the department that you did it for the insurance." "I don't own the horse." "No," said Selmer, "but I do, and I am ruined. And there is a version of this in which I am the one who wanted it done, and you are the one who did it, and Mr. Fell has been at some pains to make certain that the version exists." He put his hat on the table and sat down and rubbed his eyes. "Every hour I spend on this makes it louder. That is the thing I cannot get past. The more I do, the more it looks like what they say it is. Then stop doing it. I have considered that, and I find I can't. You must." She set the cup down. "My lord, listen to me. You cannot get me out of here, because everything you have your name, your rank, your acquaintance is the exact material they are building the story out of. It has to be somebody they have no use for. It was. The hearing was on the 10th of April, before 3 magistrates, in a paneled room over the Market Cross, and it lasted the whole morning, and for the first 2 hours it went precisely as everybody had expected it to go. The knife was produced. Fell gave his evidence, briefly and with visible distress, and was thanked. The clerk read out, without comment, the finding of the Royal Mews Inquiry of December 1852 concerning the harness of the funeral car of the late Duke of Wellington, and the name on it, which was W. Redfern. Then Elias Gaunt was called, and asked to describe the securing of the tack tent on the night of the 27th of March, and instead of answering the question, he asked the bench for permission to say something else first. "I've a thing to declare to the court," he said, "and I'd sooner have it out at the start, because it goes to what my evidence is worth." "Go on." "I'm going blind, sir. Cataract, both eyes. 2 years and a half. I've hid it from my employer and from every man in my yard, and I'm the head groom at Brackenhall, and that is a dishonest thing, and I know it. I'm 58, and I've nowhere to go." The room went very quiet. Nora, sitting between 2 constables, looked at the floor. "I did not check that girth with my eyes," Gaunt said. "I checked it with my hands, at 9:30, and I put my name to it. And the stitching in that billet was whole and hard, and standing proud when I run my thumb over it. And any man in this room who works leather knows the difference between wax standing proud and wax gone soft, and he don't need eyes for it." One of the magistrates said, "That is not evidence that nobody cut it afterward." "No, sir, this is." Gaunt turned his head slightly, the way he did. "I sleep by the tack tent. I've slept by tack for 40 year. It's where I'm quiet. Somebody come in past 2 in the morning. You saw a light? I've told you what I see, sir. I heard him." "And what does that tell us?" "It tells you it were not a horseman," said Elias Gaunt. He put both hands flat on the rail in front of him. "A man that works with horses walks a certain road, sir, and he can't help it. He goes flat-footed, and he goes wide, and he don't lift his foot clean because he spent his life on straw and cobbles, and he don't want to come down on a fork handle in the dark. You can hear the drag. Every stable lad in England drags. This one come in on his hard heel, town boot. No nails in it, and it rang on the ground sheet like a stick on a table. And he walked straight. Straight to it, sir. 9 paces from the flap to the saddle rack, in the pitch dark, in a tent he's got no business in, and he never once put a hand out to find his way. Gaunt's voice did not rise at all. I've been finding my way in the dark for 2.5 years, sir, and I know what a man sounds like when he's counting and when he ain't. That man weren't counting. He'd been in there in the daylight, and he'd measured it. And why, said the second magistrate, did you not get up? Because I thought it was one of ours, Gaunt said. God forgive me. I lay there and I thought, that'll be Sam. They rose at 1 o'clock and came back at 3:30. It was not an acquittal. Nora had known since 10 in the morning that it would not be, and she had spent the recess making herself ready for it, and she was ready when it came. There was, the chairman said, evidence upon which a jury might convict, and there was evidence which raised a most serious question as to whether some other person had had access. The case would go forward to the summer assizes at Salisbury. In the meantime, the defendant would be admitted to bail in the sum of £200, herself in 100, with 2 sureties in 50 each, and would not leave the county of Wiltshire without leave of the court. Lord Selmere stood up before the words were finished. So did Sam Wicklow, who did not have £50 and never had, and whose brother-in-law kept the fleece and did. Nora walked out of the Market Cross at 4 in the afternoon into a street full of people reading about the Baltic Fleet, and nobody in it knew or cared who she was. And she stood on the step in the light for a moment with her eyes shut. Elias Gaunt was waiting by the cart. "You've thrown yourself away," she said. "Aye. Everybody in Wiltshire knows now." "Aye." He climbed up. "Get in, Miss Redfern. It's a long road and I can't drive." April was the worst month of her life, and she had had some competition. The commission suspended its consideration of the Brackenhall stud contract pending the resolution of certain matters. The phrase was Colonel Marchmont's own, and it was a kindness, and it might as well have been a coffin lid. By the end of the month, Stourton and Fell had been given the remount supply for 2 regiments of light dragoons and a battery, and there was a paragraph about it in the trade papers describing Mr. Randall Stourton as a gentleman whose patriotism in the present emergency did him great credit. And on the 22nd of April, the Ordnance Veterinary Department circulated its report on the animal examined at Battlesbury on the 28th of March. Selmere read it out to her in the study because she asked him to. Chestnut entire, rising 9, 17.1. Conformation good. Wind and limb sound. Temper violent under saddle without warning. Has occasioned grave injury to a farrier at the Kent depot in May last. Was the proximate cause of a near-fatal accident at Battlesbury. In the opinion of this department, the animal is untrustworthy in character and unfit for any service, and it is recommended that he be destroyed. "One more signature," Selmere said. "That is all it wants. It goes to the Director General, and he signs it, and they send a man down with a pistol. And there is not a court in England that will stop them, because he is not a person. He is a hazard." Nora sat with her hands in her lap. How long? Weeks. Perhaps 2 months. There is a war on, and they are not quick. He folded the paper. "Miss Redfern, don't. I am going to say it, and you may do as you like with it afterward." He put the report on the desk and stood with his back to the fire, and he did not do it well, which was the only thing about it she was ever able to forgive. "Marry me." She did not move. "I have thought about it for a month, and I can find no honest objection except the ones that are about me," he said. "You would be safe. There is not a magistrate in this county who would put the Countess of Selmere before a jury on the word of a contractor's man. The horse would be my wife's property, and no department in Whitehall could take him. Your father's name and your own would be a matter of family and not of evidence." He stopped. "And I would like it very much, which is the part I have no business mentioning." The fire moved. "No," Nora said. "Will you tell me why?" "Yes, because you've earned that." She stood up. "My lord, for 11 years I did the best work in England under another person's name, and I let them do it, because the alternative was not doing the work. And when it went wrong, there was nothing of me on any piece of paper anywhere in the world, and I could not put my hand up and say that was mine, not the failure, and not the 11 years before it either." Her voice had gone quite steady. "You are offering me a name. It is a very good one, and you mean it kindly, and I don't doubt for 1 minute that it would work. Then, I don't want another name, I want my own back." She picked up the report off the desk and put it in her pocket. "And if I take yours before I have it, I shall spend the rest of my life being a woman who was rescued, and so will you. And by about the 4th year, you would begin to know it, and I could not bear that." Selmere was quiet for a long moment. "When you have it back," he said, "may I ask again?" "You may ask again," Nora said. The court gave her leave to go up to London for 8 days on the application of her sureties. She left Brackenhall on the morning of the 26th on the coach. The house was in a court off Broad Wall in Lambeth, 3 floors, a stair that leaned, and a smell of coal smoke and river damp that she recognized before she had got to the first landing. The woman on the ground floor said yes. There was an old gentleman on the top back. Been there a year and a half. Very quiet. Did copying. Nora stood outside the door for perhaps half a minute. Then she knocked, and a voice she had known all her life said, "It's not locked." He was sitting at a deal table under the window with his coat on, because there was no fire, and there was a sheet of foolscap in front of him, and a pen in his hand, and a lamp burning at 11 in the morning, because the window gave onto a wall 4 feet away. Wilkin Redfern was 68. His hand shook, and had for years. It was why they had taken him off the horses in 1841, and why they had needed a pair of hands to put under his warrant in the first place. His hair had gone entirely. There was a bottle on the shelf, and it was 3/4 down, and it was 11 in the morning. He looked up. He did not say her name. He put the pen down very carefully in the groove of the inkstand, the way he had always done, and he put both hands in his lap where she could not see them, and he said, "You'll have found out about the boy then." Nora shut the door behind her. "They told me you were dead," she said. "I know. A man told me in the street. In April, last year, outside the farrier's in Long Acre. He said you'd gone in the winter and been buried decent out of a lodging house. And he was sorry, and he shook my hand." Her voice was doing something she could not control. "I mourned you. I sat in my own kitchen in Marlbury, and I mourned you. His name's Fell," her father said, "and I asked him to." She had to put her hand on the back of the chair. "You asked him to. I told him I couldn't have you looking for me. He said it to the table. You'd have found me in a week. You'd have found me, and you'd have took me out of here and put me in your cottage in the country, and you'd have kept me on nothing, with nothing coming in. And it would have been 6 months before you asked me a question I couldn't answer." He picked up the pen again and put it down. "So I paid 30 shillings of my own money to a man to tell my daughter I was in the ground. That's what I am, Nora. You'd best have it at the start. What is it?" You couldn't answer. He turned the foolscap round on the table so that she could see it. It was a certificate of soundness for 4 cavalry troopers, made out in a small, very regular hand, sloping a little, with the tail of the Y turned back under. "I've been copying for Storton and Fell since '44, Wilkin Redfern said. 10-year, certificates of origin, certificates of soundness, bills of sale, attestations of pedigree for animals that never had a pedigree, because there's no book for a troop horse, and there never has been. You can put down what you like about a 9-year-old gelding and there's not a soul in England can contradict you." He looked at his own hands. "I don't sign my name to 'em, girl. I'm not that far gone. I copy 'em fair from a draft in another man's hand, and a warranted man signs the fair copy. 30 shilling the month, and my rent, and no questions of me, and I have never once asked what any of it was for. The letters to the boy come in the same packet as the certificates. Drafts in the same hand. Fold direct and put in the post at Waterloo." He was very still. "There's no name on them, and I never read past the first line, because I found early on that if you don't read it, you can go on." "You copied out an instruction," Nora said, "to a 17-year-old boy to put spirit of wine into the stitching of a rein on a horse I was riding. I never knew whose horse it was. You knew the boy was at Brackenhall. I knew there was a boy in Wiltshire, and in November of '52, she said, when they wanted a name to put on the inspection return of the funeral car, and there was only ever one name on that return, and it was yours. Did you know then?" Her father did not answer. "They came to you," Nora said. "Somebody came to you and said, 'Sign the statement. Say that the inspection was your daughter's, that she worked under your warrant, that she went alone, that you cannot vouch for it.' And you signed. Why? Because a man come and sat in that chair you're holding," Wilkin Redfern said, "and said that if there was an inquiry into that leather, there'd be an inquiry into all the paper it come with. And the paper it come with had 10 year of my hand on it. The lamp burned in the middle of the morning. I sold you," he said, "for 30 shilling a month, and not having to look at myself. That's the sum. There's no better way of putting it, and I've had a year and a half to try." Nora stood in the middle of the room and found that she was not going to cry, and that she was not going to shout, and that there was, in fact, nothing in her at all for him. No rage, no forgiveness, nothing but a kind of enormous flat quiet, as though a room she had lived in had been taken away, and there was only the outline of it on the wall. "I want the ledger," she said. He looked up. "You kept one. You have kept a book of work done and money owed since I was 6 years old, because you cannot help it. And there will be a line in it for every sheet you have copied for that firm in 10 years. It'd hang me. It might," Nora said. "Where is it?" Wilkin Redfern got up and went to the bed and took out from under the mattress a quarto book bound in green cloth with the corners gone. He held it a moment. Then he put it into his daughter's hands and sat down again at the table and picked up his pen, because it was the only thing he knew how to do with his hands. The ledger was 211 pages, and it took her 4 days. He had kept it the way he had taught her to keep a feed book, which was to say ruthlessly, date, description, folios, fee, paid or owing, 10 years of it, certificates of soundness by the dozen, bills of sale, attestations of pedigree in blocks of 40 at the back end of a quarter, when a regiment was buying and a contractor needed paper faster than paper could honestly be made. The pattern came up off the pages by the second afternoon, and it was not subtle once you had the trick of it. A horse would be bought in England cheap, out of a farm sale or a coaching stable or a cast lot from the Crown's own yards. A month later there would be a fair copy in Wilkin Redfern's small regular hand describing that same animal, same age, same height, same markings as a Hanoverian, imported by way of Hamburg, with a pedigree of 3 generations that existed nowhere on earth. And the ordnance would pay 4 times. It worked, Nora saw, for exactly one reason. There was no book. The thoroughbred had a stud book, and had had one for 60 years. You could not lie about a racehorse for 10 minutes. But nobody in England kept a register of troop horses, or of half-breds, or of the 8,000 nameless animals the army bought every year with 4 legs and a mouth. And so there was nothing in the world to contradict a piece of paper except another piece of paper. 3 entries in the whole 10 years carried a note in the margin that appeared nowhere else. 1849. April, chestnut entire, 16.3 rising, off hind. Certif, origin Hanover 3 gen, fee 4s remarked, 1849. April, bay gelding 15.3, certif, origin Hanover 2 gen, fee 4s remarked, 1849. May, chestnut entire, 17 hands, no white. Certif, origin Hanover 3 gen, fee 6s remarked. Note Muse cast lot March. Nora read the third one about 40 times. She went back to Lambeth on the 5th morning, with it under her arm, and put it on the table in front of her father, and her finger on the line. What does remarked mean? He looked at it a long time. I don't know, he said. And then, because she went on standing there, I don't know, girl. It's a word off the draft. There was a sheet come with those three, and the word was on it, and I copied what was on it. I put it in my book, because I put everything in my book. Muse cast lot March. That'll be the March sale. The Royal Muse casts its horses, same as anybody, old ones, spoiled ones, wrong color for the grays. They go for what they'll fetch. He rubbed his mouth. £8, £10, 15 for a good one, and a month later, this one is a 3-generation Hanoverian entire. What did the ordinance pay? It's not in my book. I never saw the money side. He said it almost eagerly, which she found unbearable. But an imported entire in 49, for a stud contract £60. 70. Nora closed the ledger. So somebody bought a horse out of the Queen's own stables for £12, she said. Sold him back to the Queen's own army for 70, and did it 3 times in 6 weeks. And the only thing on earth that could give it away is the horse. They'd have altered the description. You can alter a description. You can't alter an animal. She picked up her gloves. Unless you remark him. Her father sat very still. That's the brand, he said. Wicklow went into Kent that week with £3 of the Earl's money and a written question, and came back on the Friday with an answer and a farrier. Aaron Peck was 38 and walked with 2 sticks and would not be shoeing anything again. And he sat in the kitchen at Brackenhall with his hat on his knees and told it plainly because he had been wanting to tell somebody for a year. He never come at me. Miss, that's the thing I couldn't get no one to write down. He shifted his hip. They had him for a review, see, and the sergeant wanted him hogged main off, short, regulation. It was that or plate him, and there weren't time. So I got the shears and I went up his neck and I got hold of the mane. And he went through me like a gate, Peck said. Not at me. Through. He were trying to get out from under my hand, and I were stood where the wall was. He looked at his sticks. I've shod horses 15 year. I know the difference between a horse that means it and a horse that's took the shortest way out of a room. There weren't a mark on me from a tooth nor a foot. It were his shoulder. He put me into the standing and went off up the lines. Had anybody tried it before? That's what I asked after. And the corporal says, oh, aye. There was a trooper done for the same way at the back end of 52, week or 2 before the old Duke's funeral, and he'd been trying to hog him and all. Peck turned his hat round. So they stopped hogging him. They let the mane grow, and they put a chain on him instead. And I got worse from that day to the day they sold him off. Nora went out into the yard afterward and stood by herself in the rain for a while. 11 months she had written in her own book in October. Not quiet since some time in the back end of 52. She had put it down to the chain. She went to him at 5 in the morning on the 30th of June, alone, with a lamp and no shears. He was lying down. He got up when he heard her, in the ordinary way, and put his nose against her chest and stood while she scratched the place under his jaw that he liked, and she let it go on a long time. I'm going to hurt you, she told him. I'm sorry. She began where Aldwyn had taught her to begin, which was not with the hands at all, weight even. Shoulders turned a quarter away, breathing out slower than in. until the horse's own breathing came down to meet it. Then the jaw, "I am here." Then the long sweep, "I am not going to." At last, 2 fingers below the ear, and the pause, and the release. "You may." She waited 4 minutes between each. Then she brought her hand up onto the crest of his neck and began to work along it. And she did the thing she had done 10,000 times in a paddock, and never once here. Too short, one long, too short. He sweated instantly, all over, the way he always did, dark down the neck and the flank in about 4 seconds. She did not stop, and she did not take her hand away. She stood at his shoulder with her palm flat on the crest and went on breathing out slower than in. And she kept the pressure absolutely even. And she talked to him about the frost in the valley and the blackbird and the crumbs on the windowsill. And Corunna shook from the pole to the hock and did not move his feet. It took 11 minutes. Then something in him gave up. She felt it go, a long unclenching under her hand, and he dropped his head almost to the straw and stood there trembling and let her do it. Nora lifted the mane. Under the long hair, on the crest of the neck, 4 inches below the pole, the skin was hairless and thickened and gray, in a rough oblong the size of a man's palm. There were 2 brands in it. The upper one was crude. It had been laid on badly by somebody in a hurry with an iron that was too hot, and it had spread in the burning and taken a piece of the main bed with it, and it said, more or less, over a numeral, in the German fashion. Under it, deeper, older, and burned with an iron that had been made by a proper smith and used by a man who knew what he was doing, was a crown. A crown, and beneath the crown 4 figures. And Nora Redfern had seen that mark on the near shoulder of every cast horse that had gone out of the Royal Mews in the 11 years she worked there. And she had watched Fergus Aldwyn lay it on with his own hands more times than she could count. She stood in a loose box at 5:30 in the morning with her hand on a horse's neck and the whole of it turned over in front of her like a card. Nobody had ever wanted to kill her. That was the thing. That was what she had had upside down since January. They had not been trying to break her neck in the lower paddock or send Selmer onto the stones of the Wylye, and they had not been trying to ruin a woman who sold chamomile in Marlbury, because she had never been worth ruining. She had walked into the middle of it in October by accident and made a nuisance of herself, and they had gone round her twice and then gone through her, and that was all. What they wanted was the horse. Not the horse alive somewhere and forgotten in a Kent depot, where he had been for 4 years, while Randall Storton very likely believed him long since dead. Not the horse quiet and rideable, and standing in front of the Ordnance Veterinary Department in the sunshine with a clean coat and a shortened mane, where any man with a memory and a pair of eyes might one day lift the hair. They wanted him condemned, officially, in the Army's own hand, by the Army's own surgeon, on the Army's own paper, untrustworthy in character and unfit for any service, recommended that he be destroyed. A vicious horse can be shot legally in front of witnesses, and nobody in England asks a single question afterward, and the mark goes into the ground with him. Every hour she had spent in 8 months quieting him had been an hour spent making that harder. Every day he stood still was a day the argument got weaker. And in January and February, when they had put oil under his blanket and spirit in his rein and failed to make him dangerous again, they had done the only thing left and made her dangerous instead, because a horse whose keeper is awaiting trial at the assizes has nobody to speak for him at all. Corunna lifted his head off the straw and put his muzzle against her arm.
"You've been trying to tell everybody for 5 years, Nora said.
She had 7 days, and she did not spend one of them alone. That was the difference, and she was aware of it every hour, and it never once stopped being uncomfortable. The telegraph went out from Warminster on the Monday to Newmarket, 16 words at a shilling, Aldwin. Need you at Lincoln, 12 July. Crown mark under false Hanover brand. Come. Redfern. The answer came back on the Tuesday afternoon in 9 words, and one of them was spelled wrong, and Nora put it in her pocket and kept it there for a month. Fergus Aldwin was 74. He had laid the Royal Mews mark on Crown horses for 22 years and had trained the man who trained the man who did it now, and there was nothing on earth he could tell a court about the horse's character. But he could tell them what iron made that crown, and when the pattern of it had been changed, and how deep the smith's cut ran in the 7th year of the old Queen's uncle, and no living person could contradict him. Selmer went to Weatherby's in London, which everybody afterward assumed was to have the horse traced, and which was, in fact, the opposite. Nora wanted a gentleman of unimpeachable respectability to stand up in front of the agricultural interest of England and say, in as many words, that there was no register of army horses, that there never had been, that a certificate of origin for a half-bred entire was worth precisely what the man who wrote it was worth, and that the entire trade rested on nobody ever checking. It was the plainest possible statement of fact, and it was the floor Randall Storton had been standing on for 10 years, and Nora intended to take it out from under him in front of 600 people. Elias Gaunt went round the county on his cob, with Toby driving him. He came back on the Thursday with 4 head grooms from 4 houses between Devizes and Shaftesbury, all of whom had bought imported Hanoverians from Storton and Fell in the last decade, and every one of whom had privately thought the animal did not look like any Hanoverian he had ever seen, and none of whom had ever said so to a living soul, because you do not tell a gentleman that he has been made a fool of. 2 of them agreed to have their horses looked at. One of the 2 had a bay gelding of about 16 years standing in his paddock with a very long mane. Toby Lark wrote his last letter on the Friday. Nora dictated it and made him copy it twice and burned the first. It said that the animal was to be shown at the Royal Agricultural Society's meeting at Lincoln on the 12th, at his lordship's insistence and against all advice, that the woman was to ride him herself, the ordnance report notwithstanding, and that, in the boy's opinion, she meant to make a public exhibition of the thing, and there would be gentlemen of the press present. "He'll come," Selmer said, reading it over her shoulder. "He'll send Fell, and if he does neither, then Aldwin looks at a brand in front of 600 farmers," Nora said, "and it is a great deal less than I want, and it is still enough to keep the horse alive." The statement was drawn on the Saturday by the lawyer from Salisbury, 11 pages of it, with the ledger appended, and Peck's account, and the veterinary report, and the die, and the letters, and the 17 half-sheets in a small, very regular hand. They signed it in the tack room at Brackenhall on the evening of the 8th of July, with the stove out and the door open to the yard. Fergus Aldwin signed first, having arrived that afternoon and slept 4 hours. Then Aaron Peck, slowly, with his sticks against the bench. Then Sam Wicklow. Then Toby Lark, who was the only one who cried. Then Elias Gaunt, running downhill, with Nora's thumb on the line. Then Adrian Codry. Nora signed last, and her hand shook, and this time she let them see it. The Royal Agricultural Society came to Lincoln in the 2nd week of July and put up a town on 40 acres of grass below the cathedral. There were 800 implements in the sheds. There were portable steam engines going all day in a line along the north side, thumping and smoking, with a rope in front of them to keep the boys off. There were cattle and sheep in hurdles, and a marquee where a man could get his dinner for 2 shillings, and the crowd came in by the Great Northern from 3 counties, and on the Wednesday there were, by the Society's own count, 19,000 people on the ground. The horse ring was on the south side, roped with a stand at one end, At 2:30 on the Wednesday afternoon, the stand held Colonel Rufus Marchmont and 4 officers of the Remount Commission, 2 gentlemen from Weatherby's, the Society's stewards, a bench of Lincolnshire farmers who had come to look at Shorthorns and stayed because word had gone round, reporters from 3 London papers and the Mark Lane Express, and, in the second row, comfortable, beautifully turned out, with his hat on his knee, Mr. Randall Stourton. Josiah Fell was not in the stand. Nobody was quite sure where Fell was, and Sam Wicklow had been asked to make it his business and had lost him twice already among the implement sheds. Nora came into the ring at 20-3, riding side saddle, in the same habit taken in at the waist, on a chestnut entire of 17 hands 1 inch, with his mane hanging long over the near side of his neck. Somebody laughed. It went round the way laughter does in a crowd that has been standing in the sun since 11, an easy, contented ripple of it. 300 people enjoying the sight of a woman on a stallion. And it got as far as the stand before it thinned out. Nora had expected it. She had expected it since April, and had discussed it with Aldwin twice. And the old man had said the only useful thing anybody said to her that month, which was, let 'em. They'll stop. She walked him once round on a long rein. The second circuit she picked him up and trotted, and the laughing stopped. Because there is a certain kind of movement that shuts a crowd up whether it knows anything about horses or not. The third circuit she cantered him, and the ring went quiet enough to hear the steam engines on the north side. And at the top of the fourth, 40 yards from the ropes, with the horse going as sweetly as he had ever gone in his life, somebody fired a fowling piece behind the implement sheds. It went off flat and enormous and much too close. Corunna came up. He went up so high that people in the front of the crowd went over backward, getting away from the rope, and he came down and went sideways in one movement, and Nora was gone off the near side, no choice in it. Side saddle, and a horse that goes left at that speed will part company every time, and she hit the grass on her shoulder for the second time that year and rolled. The stand came to its feet. The stallion went round the ring at a flat gallop with the reins swinging and the irons banging and 1,100 weight of him going into the turf, and 2 stewards ran at his head and were very sensibly not there when he arrived. And somewhere in the stand a voice said, quite distinctly, there it is. That's the animal they rode up. Colonel Marchmont did not sit down, he said, afterward, that he had begun to reach for the sergeant's arm. Nora got up. She did not run, and she did not shout, and she did not go after him. She stood in the middle of the ring, in her torn habit, with her hair down her back, and she turned in a slow half-circle until she was facing the way he was coming. Then she opened her right hand, palm up, at her side, and she whistled. It was 2 notes, low, one falling into the other and rising again, and it was not loud enough to carry 10 feet. And there were 19,000 people on that ground, and 3 steam engines going, and not one soul in the stand heard a sound. Corunna came round the top of the ring at a gallop and broke to a canter. He came down the long side and broke to a trot, and 40 feet from her he dropped to a walk with his head low and his ears going forward, and came the rest of the way and put his muzzle into her open hand. Nobody in the stand said anything at all. He stood there blowing, with the reins hanging, and Nora put her free hand up flat against the plane of his cheek and let him breathe. And the ring was so quiet that people at the back could hear him do it. Then she looked up at the stand. "Colonel Marchmont," she said. Her voice was not loud either, and it did not need to be. "I would be obliged if you would come down here, and Mr. Aldwin, and any 2 gentlemen the stewards care to send." They came down, Marchmont and 2 stewards, and Fergus Aldwin with his stick, and after a moment 1 of the men from Weatherby's, and after another moment 3 reporters who had not been invited and were not stopped. Nora put her hand on the crest of the horse's neck. This animal was condemned by the Ordnance Veterinary Department on the 22nd of April as untrustworthy in character, she said. You have all just seen why. Now I will show you what it is he is frightened of, and I am going to do it slowly because it takes him 11 minutes. It took 9 minutes in the middle of a show ring at Lincoln with 19,000 people on the ground and the steam engines thumping away on the north side, while a woman stood at a horse's shoulder with her palm flat on his neck and talked to him about a blackbird on a windowsill. He sweated. He shook from the pole to the hock. He put his head down almost to the grass, and then he let her lift the mane. Fergus Aldwyn got down on one knee in front of the whole Royal Agricultural Society, which at 74 he had no business doing, and looked at the crest of that neck for about 15 seconds. Then he stood up and turned round to the stand. The top one's a fraud, he said, and it's a poor one. Laid on hot and quick by a man that didn't know his trade. You can see he's let the iron drag. There's a tail on the R a half-inch long. That's meant for a Hanoverian mark, and it wouldn't fool a German for a minute. And the one beneath? Said Marchmont. The one beneath, said Fergus Aldwyn, I put on myself. The stand made a sound. That's the crown mark of the Royal Mews. Crown over 4 figures, and the figures is the cast number and the year. He tapped the grass with his stick. The bar under the crown was altered in 41 because the old iron had wore. That's the new bar. I laid this mark, or a man I trained laid it, on every horse cast out of Her Majesty's stables between 39 and 51, and there's nobody else alive that made 'em, and I'd know it on a wall in the dark. You are saying, said Marchmont slowly, that this is a crown-cast horse. I'm saying he went out of the Mews sale in the March of 49 for about £12, Aldwyn said, and I'd very much like somebody to tell me what the ordnance paid for him in the May. £72.10, said Lord Selmere from the rope. It is in the ordnance ledger for that quarter, and I have the certificate of origin that was sold with him, and it describes him as imported by way of Hamburg with 3 generations of pedigree. And there is no such horse, and there has never been any such pedigree, because there is no book in England in which such a pedigree could be written. He held up 11 pages. There is a statement here, he said, signed by 7 persons. And that was the moment when Randall Stourton stood up, in the second row of the stand, with his hat in his hand, and did the only thing left to a man of his sort, which was to laugh comfortably and say that this was all very entertaining, but that a brand on a horse's neck proved nothing whatever about who had put it there. No, said a voice from the back of the stand, it don't. I do. He had come up on the excursion train that morning with Wicklow's brother-in-law, and he had sat at the back for 3 hours in his good coat, and his hands were shaking so badly that he had to hold the rail with both of them. My name's Wilkin Redfern, he said, and I've copied paper for that gentleman for 10 years, and I've got the dates of every sheet of it, and I signed a false statement in the December of 52 against my own daughter to stop an inquiry, and I'd like to be took somewhere and asked about it properly. Nobody moved in the whole of that stand. Nora Redfern stood in the middle of the ring with her hand on a horse's neck and did not look at her father, and could not afterward remember one single thing that anybody said for the next quarter of an hour. They took Josiah Fell an hour later at the Lincoln station with a fowling piece in a gun case and a ticket for London, and he had the wit to say nothing at all, and it did not help him in the end. It went to pieces very quickly after that, the way these things do once one board is out. Randall Stourton was arrested in Islington on the 24th of July on a charge of conspiracy to defraud the Board of Ordnance, and it might have gone on for years, and it did not, because the summer of 1854 was the worst possible summer in the history of England to be a contractor to Her Majesty's forces. The army was in the East by then. The first letters were coming home. By September, the newspapers had begun on the commissariat, the boots that came apart, the tents that let the rain through, the horse leather that had been passed as sound and had rotted at Varna in a fortnight, and there was no appetite anywhere in the kingdom for a gentleman who had sold the Queen her own cast horses back at 6 times the price. He was, as the Times observed in October, the first name on a list which was expected to be a long one. The Royal Mews inquiry was reopened on the 11th of August. It went quietly, and it took 4 months, and the finding, when it came, occupied a single paragraph and did not appear in any newspaper at all. But in the second week of the sitting, a clerk turned up, in a bundle of unactioned correspondence from the autumn of 1852, a memorandum of 4 sides in a small, neat hand. It was dated the 19th of October, 1852. It was headed Ceremonial Harness Leather, supplied under contract, Stourton and Fell. It described, in the flat, unhurried language of somebody who has handled leather all her life, a pattern of dry rot in the flesh side of 3 traces and 2 breast collars, invisible from the grain side, consistent with hides, tanned too fast and finished with grease to hide it. It recommended that the whole set be rejected and replaced. It was signed H. Redfern, not W., which was the only time in 11 years she had ever done it, and it was the reason it had gone into a drawer. She had not been blamed because she was convenient. She had been blamed because she was right, and because the alternative to blaming her was an inquiry into every hide the firm had supplied to the Crown since 1844. The Wiltshire Summer Assizes had sat at Salisbury 3 weeks before that, on the 2nd of August, and had thrown out the case against her in a morning. There was, the judge observed, no evidence upon which any jury could properly convict, and a good deal upon which they might convict somebody else, and he hoped the Crown would attend to it. Toby Lark was not prosecuted. Colonel Marchmont saw to that personally in a letter of some warmth, and afterward gave the boy a character that was frankly excessive. His mother and the 2 younger children came out of Southwark in the September and into a cottage on the Brackenhall estate, and his mother lived another 31 years and never once went back to London. Elias Gaunt's eyes did not improve. There was no operation and no miracle, and Nora never pretended otherwise to him. He was made head groom emeritus at Brackenhall at his full wage, which had no meaning whatever in the strict sense, and what it meant in practice was that a man sat on a corn bin in the middle of that yard for another 9 years, and heard a horse going short on a near 4 2 days before anybody else saw it. Wilkin Redfern gave evidence 3 times and was not charged. He came down into Wiltshire in the November and was put into a small house at the far end of the estate, near the drying yards, with a fire and a woman to do for him twice a week, and a small allowance paid quarterly out of Nora's own wages and not the Earl's. She did not visit him. She wrote at Christmas and at Easter 4 lines, and had 4 lines back in a small, very regular hand, and that went on for 6 years until he died, and there was no reconciliation. And nobody who knew the whole of it ever suggested to her that there ought to have been. The remount contract came in September. It did not come to Lord Selmere. That was the part he enjoyed most, and he told the story about it for the next 30 years to anybody who would sit still. Colonel Marchmont wrote from the Ordnance to Miss H. Redfern, Brackenhall, Wiltshire, and offered, on behalf of the Commission, an arrangement for the schooling and preparation of remount horses, 80 head the first year, rising the terms to be settled with her, and the work to be done under her direction and her name. There had been an argument about that inside the department, apparently, and it had gone on for 3 weeks, and Marchmont had won it by asking his colleagues which of them proposed to explain to the Royal Agricultural Society why the ordinance would not employ the woman it had watched at Lincoln. She read it standing in the tack room with the door open to the yard, and then she read it again, and then she went and found him. He was up on the West Hill under the big oak with the horse, on a slack rein, in the low gold light of a September evening. From up there you could see the whole of it, the pale house, the red stable block, the paddocks, the elm avenue going away south, the shut windows of the east wing, which were not shut any more. "They've given it to me," she said. "I know." Marchmont wrote to me as well, to say that he was not writing to me. Selmere handed her the rein and put his hands in his pockets. "I am told my part in the arrangement is to own the buildings. It's 80 head. It is 110 with the option. And it will keep this estate for 20 years, and I am aware that I have done almost nothing to deserve it." He said it cheerfully. "You may say so, if you like. You generally do." Nora stood and looked out over the valley for a while with the rein in her hand. "You said you might ask again. I did." "Well," she said. Adrian Caudry turned round and looked at her. He did not do it any better the second time, which she had known he wouldn't, and she was not able afterward to give anybody a reliable account of the words, and neither was he. What she remembered was that he asked it standing up in a field, with mud on his boots, at the end of a working day, and that she was not in any kind of trouble at all when he did it, and that this was the whole of the difference. "Yes," she said. The sun came down onto the rim of the valley and put the light along the underside of the clouds, and away below them somebody lit the lamp in the tack room window, and then the one over the arch, and then the lamps of the house began to go on one at a time. Corunna put his head over Nora's shoulder and breathed. She reached into the pocket of her apron, which she had not stopped wearing and never did, and brought out what had been living in the bottom of it since the October before, a crushed handful of lavender, gone gray and brittle, stems broken, the flowers faded to almost nothing, worth a halfpenny to somebody desperate. She held it out on a flat, open palm. The horse dropped his nose into her hand, and the smell came up between the three of them, dry and sweet and 11 months old. The smell of a market square on a Tuesday morning, and it reached them, as it always had, a moment before anything else did. Then they walked down the hill together in the last of the light, and behind them the oak stood black against the sky, and below them Brackenhall lit itself window by window, and the sound of the evening feed being measured into buckets came up faint and steady through the cooling air.